Time. 10 wins. You give us 22 minutes. We'll give you the world.
Good morning. 64 degrees at 8 o'clock. It's Tuesday, September 11th. I'm Lee Harris. Here's what's happening.
News for Tuesday, September 11th. 8 a.m. in Salisbury, North Carolina, 7 a.m. in Chicago, 5 a.m. in Calaveras County, California, where the news is being made on this Tuesday, September 11th.
From CNN. That's all coming up. 8
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
It appears that there is more and more fire and smoke enveloping the very top of the building, and as fire crews are descending on this area, it does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Has
just I did not see a plane go in. That just exploded.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
So the whole takes about, looks like 6-7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Hold on just a moment. We've got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
Okay, the whole building just exploded some more. The whole top part.
Okay.
The building's still intact. People are running up the streets.
You are looking at this picture. It is the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, both of them being damaged by impacts from planes. We saw one happen at about maybe 9 minutes before the top of the hour, and just moments ago, so maybe 18 minutes after the first impact, the second tower was impacted by another, what appeared to be another passenger plane.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
We also have a report now that it was a plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and we have a large fire at the Pentagon. The Pentagon is being evacuated as we speak.
There is a lot of confusion here at the Pentagon. It appears that something hit the Pentagon on the outside of the 5th corridor, on the Army corridor. Several Army officers I talked to reported hearing a big explosion, seeing shards of metal coming past their window. The Pentagon has been evacuated.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
America is down in the general vicinity. Dan, can you tell us what has just happened?
Yes, Peter, it's Don Daly down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it.
Thanks very much, Dan. Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter had been, the top half had been fully involved.
There's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord. There are no words.
September 11th, 2001.
a day of grief, a day of courage. This is how that day unfolded.
How you doing, everybody? This is David Cantu.
This is Jenna Gazelle.
This is a very special episode of Coaster Challenge Podcasts, and today we got a pretty powerful episode for all of you guys because it is Friday, September 10th, and tomorrow it's going to be the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And I will tell you guys, that is definitely... I can't get over it, Jenna. It's been 20 years since that tragic day.
It feels like it was just yesterday, actually.
I will say that every time we have an anniversary of 9/11, I will say it just, the flashbacks I get from that day, from what I saw, I was just, it just feels like it's with you every day. It's just, I would say, I think in our generation, this is probably the most tragic event we've ever witnessed in our lifetime, because I know that our country has really gone through some major challenges in the past. I would say the worst from before 9/11 was Pearl Harbor.
Well, for our generation, this is kind of our Pearl Harbor for the generation that's before, from the,
Yes, and this was actually the first terrorist attack that actually targeted average citizens in this country, which it just blows me away that there are people in this world that would even think about doing events like this. It's mind-boggling in my mind what people can do.
I think even 20 years later, it's still kind of hard to wrap your head around. I mean, I got to go down to New York in 2014, and my mentor told me, because I wanted to go down to the site, and my mentor told me, she goes, being an empath for me, she was like, don't do it because the emotions down there are so heavy and so hard to deal with. As you can tell, choking up over this, it wouldn't be the same. It would be too hard for me to handle as an empath. I
can only imagine that because I have never been to New York City. Now, I've been to Washington. I went to Washington back in 2019. And I got to see Pentagon, and I drove by and saw the memorial that is there for the 9/11, for the tragedy that happened there. But I do plan to go to New York next year. That is one of the number one places I do want to go, and I'm trying to prepare myself because I know a lot of people that have been down at the memorial. They said it's a very powerful environment of emotions, especially when you walk the museum.
Yeah, my mentor, she went down there and she said even for her it was very overpowering for emotions, and she was like, even though she knew that I really wanted to, being that I just started on my spiritual journey of everything, of being a psychic and being an empath, she definitely was like, don't go down there because it would hurt me a lot because of just feeling all those emotions. And for people that don't understand what an empath is, side note, we feel everything from what a person that's sitting across the room for us, or if there's a bunch of people in a room, we can pinpoint basically what emotions everybody's feeling. So her telling me not to go down there, I took her advice, because even now, 20 years later, it still kind of affects me, because it's like that, all those emotions that go through your head of what everybody was going through. It's really hard.
Yeah, that day, it hit me the hardest. Even though we're here from the West Coast, I will tell you that is a day, all of us. That's why, remember after 9/11, the banners, the shirts, the bumper stickers, the message, the slogan that went across this country. It wasn't just United We Stand, but it also said, we will never forget.
Right.
And this is definitely a day we will never forget. And I will say 9/11 hits real home to me because I'm going to try and make this a quick story. I was in college when 9/11 happened, and I was an architect major. Now, Jenna, you've known me all through school. You knew my passion and dream was to always be an architect, because you knew how I love to design. I love designing buildings, houses,
and your
landscape,
Legos
and out of my Legos too. I would take my designs and literally build them out of Lego models. Well, I was in architect school. Well, this is what's so ironic, is that our professor, this is before 9/11 happened. This was like a year before. Our professor told each classmate that he wanted us to pick a piece of architecture that we loved. And he wanted us to research it, study it, and he wanted us to give a presentation in front of the class with a model of our architecture and photos, and do like a whole presentation, PowerPoint, model display, everything. So an entire year. The model, my most favorite piece of architecture that I did a presentation and I shared, was the Twin Towers at New York City in Manhattan. I was very fascinated with the World Trade Center. It was always my dream to go visit those Twin Towers. On that day, and I researched and learned everything, like how, because we had to learn how it was constructed, how it was all designed and built, why was the design done the way it was done. I learned all that in 2000, year before, all following up to 9/11. When 9/11 hit and those towers got hit, my eyes were glued to the TV, but I already knew, looking at the impact zones of the towers, I had a gut-wrenching feeling. In my personal view, as an architect major, I thought the South Tower, I knew where it was hit was going to be doomed because of where it was hit in the middle of the tower and the weight above it. I thought the North Tower had a chance of survival because it was hit at the top, but there were a lot of things that I had to learn. But when those towers collapsed, I literally was in deep, deep sadness. I was very upset. And I will tell you, everybody in this country had what you call a silent anger, more like to call it. That silent anger was within me that morning. My most two favorite pieces of architecture destroyed. The next couple days after, I had returned to college, and my professor literally called me and said, "Hey, can you come to my office?" And him and I sat down together in his office because he knew that I had picked the World Trade Center as my favorite architect piece, and he loved the presentation I had given about it. Him and I literally sat down, and he actually brought Jenna. I guarantee it was against school rules, but he did it because of the situation we were all in after that day. He literally brought 2 Coronas, and he had them in his mini fridge. He handed me a Corona, and him and I sat at his desk. He says, "We need a beer for this one." He wanted to know how I felt, what happened that day, because he knew about the Twin Towers were my favorite piece of architecture. And I told him, I said, I'm upset. I'm really pissed off. I've got a wave of emotions right now. I don't know what to do here. But him and I were discussing about how they collapsed and because of how it was constructed. And there will be a time where I can discuss that in another episode, maybe another 9/11 episode. But we had a very in-depth conversation studying how and why those towers collapsed. And him and I both learned something new from each other. And then after that, him and I sat together with our class, and we just had a whole day just discussing about the architecture. But he actually had me run the class to talk to the students about the Twin Towers and what happened. And
you got to be teacher for the day.
Yeah, basically I got to be like the professor for the day. And you know what? He gave me high honors because of how I handled that day when he had me sit down and discuss it with the class. It was a very emotional day. There was a lot of emotions that day in that class. But I will say that I will never get a chance to see those towers now because of what the terrorists did. We will keep them in our memory. I have lots of photos, and I have great videos. I have to thank YouTube for being able to show me what the lobby looked like, what the sky lobbies, how it looked up above the observation deck. So at least I have those memories there. But at least the one thing I did was I built the Twin Towers out of Legos years ago, tall models, and I did it with love. And that's something I'm going to cherish, and I will always remember all the people that were lost on that day. Normally in our regular episodes, we do what we call the YouTube highlight clip of the week here, but because of this a special occasion and the magnitude of how 9/11 was, we decided to do something special for all you guys today. And I know this is going to be a long episode, guys, so please bear with us, but this is just such a very serious day. This is a day of American history that's going to always go down, and we were all part of it that day. We reached out to all of our previous guests that have been on the podcast so far this season, and we asked them to send us little stories, testaments of where were they on 9/11. And so take a listen.
Like many others, 9/11 is a day I'll never forget. I was in music school at the time, and I was sleeping in because I didn't have class until later that day. I was woken up by a phone call. It was my cousin. A cousin I was basically raised with. We were much more like brother and sister by this time than cousin. We were always together. Our families were always together. And she was sobbing, asking if I had any idea where my parents were, or if I had heard from them, or anything. I had just woken up, so I had no idea what was going on, and she implored me to turn the TV on, which I did, and then obviously I figured out what was going on. See, my parents were in DC that day. We hung up and spent hours, like so many other people that day, trying to find our loved ones. Calling and calling and calling and getting nowhere. Not even a ring. Eventually we did find my parents. My mother was in DC proper, downtown, being escorted out of her meeting. She recalled seeing snipers and security soldiers on the roof of the government buildings. I believe that the police had told her and the people she was with to go to a subway to shelter, but I could be wrong, but that's what I remember. When I got a hold of my father, it's funny now looking back, but at the time, it was maddening and horrific. He answered the phone and we argued. He went down because he's from Maryland, and he wanted to take a trip with Mom, but he figured while she was doing her meetings and so on, he would go look around his old neighborhood and drive through Maryland and so on, and just try to, take in some sights and memories. When I got a hold of him, though, he didn't know what was going on. He was complaining about the traffic and laughing and just in a mood that seemed odd. So I was mad at him, because I was looking for Mom, and he had no idea why I was looking for Mom. I just couldn't register in my head that he didn't know what was going on, but again, he wasn't listening to the radio. I think he was listening to a CD or an iPod or something. I don't recall exactly, but something. Once we fixed that, though, everybody was on the hunt for Mom, and then, like I said, we found her. Luckily. We were one of the lucky families. Everybody came home that day. A week later, I found out a friend from high school was actually in the Pentagon. I knew he had joined the Navy, but I didn't know he was in the Pentagon. He was a paramedic and an EMT for a while before he joined up, and he told me that when the building was hit, he didn't know what it was. He didn't know if it was a bomb or what was going on, but he did tell me that once he ran outside and saw what was going on, he ran in and started grabbing people, helping people out. Just one of so many heroes that day. To those of you who lost somebody, I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad you're here to remember those people. To those of you that just had a rough day, we were lucky. It's truly a cliche, but I can confirm to you that you really should just tell people you love them, or show them if you're not the person that uses words. Whatever your language is for showing love, do it. You don't know if you have a day, an hour, a minute. Don't waste it. Don't lose perspective when you're talking to people and hearing their sides of things. You don't know what they've been through. Try to listen. Don't wait to talk. Listen and try to see and hear things from their perspective. Take care of each other and love the ones you love and make sure they know it. This is just a short version of a story that happened to me on that day. Probably one in 1,000.
So on 9/11, we were actually at Epcot Center, and we heard the news from a park employee, and the park actually closed and was evacuated that day, and we had to leave the park. And I remember going back to my hotel room, and watching the events unfold, and just in shock and disbelief at all the horror and utter chaos that was created that day. And just still in shock to this day how someone could do that to their fellow human beings. It's kind of beyond belief. But yeah, that's my story of 9/11.
I remember being at work on 9/11, starting my day like any other, when a coworker came in to tell me of the first attack. A television had been set up in the lounge, so we all went down and gathered around to watch for news coverage when we saw the second tower attack happen live. It was such a sobering experience, and one that I'll never forget the rest of my life.
On September 11th, 2001, I remember being at work, and I had gone to the break room to get a cup of coffee. And when I got back to my floor, I remember seeing everyone gathered around one of the TV monitors. And I remember thinking to myself, something terrible must have happened. Then I saw the images on the TV of the Twin Towers burning, and I just remember standing there feeling totally numb as we watched on the TV this horrific act.
All I remember really is being asleep when it actually happened, and then I woke up and I saw it on the news probably about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. I saw what had happened on the East Coast, and I just remember being in shock and awe and just, what the heck happened. I felt very, very sorry for the firefighters that were lost there and all their families.
I remember on September 11th, 2001, that day I was a junior in high school. In that particular time, I was in study hall, and all of a sudden our principal came on the loudspeaker and made the announcement for all to hear that the Twin Towers in New York City had been struck by an airplane. And everybody stopped what they were doing in class, and you could just hear the silence through the halls. And we just asked by our teachers that day and the staff to reflect what was going on in our country and to think of all those that had lost their lives during that attack. And I can remember coming home from school that day, and everybody in my house wasn't working because their jobs had been canceled for the day. And we came together as one and watched the updates as those that were pulled from the rumble from the Trade Center and from the Pentagon, that we were lucky to be together that day as a family.
So on the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was actually asleep at home. My mom came in, tossed me the phone because my brother was at school, and she told me to, answer the phone if it's my brother's school, to go get him. And I was like dumbfounded, and I was like, why? And she was like, the Twin Towers were hit. Turn on the news. And I was just kind of in shock when she said that. So I turned on the news and was just watching the news. And, the first thing was, is my stepdad going to have to be deployed over there to help out because he was in the National Guards. So we were kind of on pins and needles waiting to see what would happen with him. I went to work that day at Save-Ons here in Burbank, and I took a picture and had it developed. And when I got home that night, I gave him one of my rings and the picture and told him if he got deployed that he had a promise that he would come back in some form.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I had actually gotten up at 5:30 in the morning here on the West Coast, and because I had college classes that morning. It was a really big day. My best friend was staying the night because him and I were going to school together, and we carpool. I got up and was doing my usual routine. I would get up, brush my teeth, and I went and jumped in the shower. And as I was taking a shower, I heard my dad shouting out for my mom. And usually on a morning in our family, my dad's always shouting. He's not a morning person, so he's always very grumpy when he's in the morning. And but this his shout out to my mom was kind of unusual. So when I finished what I had to do when I got out of the shower, I got dressed and was getting ready for school, and I saw they were both in their bedroom, and I walked in to see what the commotion was. And right as I walked in, they had the TV on the news, and it showed the Twin Towers on fire. But right as I walked in, the second plane had just hit the tower, and I walked in right when it happened. And at first I thought this was a movie because it didn't seem real. And then when I found out that this was actually happening, this was a real thing, I was just in total shock what I saw. And my eyes, along with my folks, and then my best friend woke up too from the commotion, and our eyes were just glued onto the TV screen the whole morning, and we literally watched from when the second tower hit to where the Pentagon got hit, and then watching the Twin Towers fall. I was just had this sinking feeling, like my stomach just like curled up, and I literally had to go outside and sit down and just process what I was watching that day. And we didn't even go to school that day. In fact, I remember my best friend and I, throughout that whole day on 9/11, we needed to do something to get our mind off of what it was. So we decided to go to Blockbuster Video, and we decided to rent Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. We needed a movie to get us to laugh, because it was just a day of just being sorrow, just a lot of pain and just sadness. And so, but when we were driving through the streets of Burbank, there was nobody on the streets, no cars. We walked into Blockbuster. We were the only ones in the place, and we were going to rent it, and we decided not to because there was nobody. It was like, oh my goodness. It's like we decided to I took my best friend home, and then I went home to my family, and we just spent the whole evening together, just being together as a family. In fact, my grandfather even came down even that morning because of what was going on. It was like, even my grandparents were like, they felt like they needed to be with us. They needed to have the whole family together that day. It was just surreal what we witnessed, and it was something in my generation. I have never seen anything this tragic ever happen in this country, and I was just let's just say that 9/11 will definitely be a day that if you were alive to witness what happened that day, it will always be with you. You will always remember how you felt, the pain you felt that day. And it is definitely a day I will never forget.
"20 years ago today, millions of Americans in New York, Washington, D.C., and around the country were just going about their daily lives like any other day. It was a Monday, the beginning of the work week. As they finished out the day, little did any of them know how much their world would get turned upside down the next morning. In life, the fear we face is oftentimes unfounded. Riding a roller coaster, crossing a bridge, going into the ocean. These are all common things that people fear that so rarely actually result in the outcomes that people are fearful of. Flying in airplanes, going to the top of tall buildings. These are also common phobias that so rarely come to fearful fruition with a negative outcome. 20 years ago, though, such normally safe activities became anything but safe. It was the day that the Earth stood still. On September 11th, 2001, the gravest terror attacks in the history of our civilization were carried out. Thousands of innocent men, women, and children lost their lives that day. As 19 terrorists destroyed so many lives in an instant, fear filled the hearts and minds of millions around the country and the world. What does one do when the fear is real? When a situation presents itself where concerns over fearful outcomes are well-founded? How does one deal with such a situation and survive through it? Well, today, on the 20th anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in human history, the Coaster Challenge podcast is going to explore how we go about surviving real-founded, large-scale fear. Everyone who was alive that day remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing. This is certainly true for the person I'm sitting down with today. Welcome back to the Coaster Challenge podcast, Chuck Cole.
Hello.
Hi there, Chuck.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So Chuck, so our listeners kind of understand some of the context here. So you and I, as well as David, who's of course as he always is in the background here producing the show, we were at Hollywood Nights with a whole bunch of our other friends, and it turns out just by chance that you and your son Chase were staying in the same hotel as David and I. We didn't plan that in advance; it just worked out that way. So we wound up spending a lot of time together. And I remember the second night, the Saturday night of the event. After getting back to the hotel, what was it, 2 a.m. or whatnot, after all those great night rides on Voyage, Trimless Voyage, we had you, myself, and David. Chase was, of course, asleep, but the three of us, you, David, and myself, we had a 2-3 hour conversation out in the front of the hotel there. Just great dynamic conversation. And one of the things that came up just by chance was you mentioned something very interesting that connects you in an interesting way to the attacks of 9/11. And so that's why we're talking to you today. So to start with, Chuck, why don't you tell our listeners, where were you on September 11th, 2001?
I was in New York City on the island of Manhattan in Midtown. A lot of people know the Today Show. It's at Rockefeller Plaza. NBC, their 30 Rock is, the big building there where you see the famous statue and the ice skating rink. And just one block south of that, right across the street, is 10 Rockefeller Plaza. And that's where the Today Show is. That's where they film the Today Show, right there at that ground level. And that's where you always see the crowds and people, celebrating their birthdays. Well, I was working for a branding advertising company at the time. I'd been working there for a while, spent 7 years working in Manhattan, up on the third floor, actually, right above the Today Show. That's where I was on 9/11. And for people who don't really know the city that well, that area is kind of, our buildings between 48th and 49th Street. Those are crosstown streets, kind of south to north, and between 6th and 5th Street. And, kind of from east to west, kind of, again, those streets there. And that location is, I don't know, like as a crow flies, maybe about 3.5 miles to 4 miles, depending if you have to drive away from the Twin Towers at that time.
Right.
And that's where I was. And to provide a little bit more context, I'd gotten in early that day. I was managing a large team, and I was taking 2 of my most senior managers on my team to breakfast at the Rock Center Cafe there. It's kind of ground level with the ice skating rink, almost as a treat. We were going to be planning some big projects coming up. And so we decided to come in early and kind of meet, and then kind of get back going at the office. And I was in the office at that time.
Right. And also maybe another reference for our listeners, because not everyone has been to New York, is very familiar with New York. Rockefeller Center, and that's also where the ice skating rink is, of course, the famous ice skating rink. That's about 10 blocks or so north of Times Square and the theater district. And so it's kind of the beginning of that kind of busy area that goes from, again, the Rockefeller Center, the ice skating rink, down into Times Square, into the Greenwich Village, and so forth, and then getting into lower Manhattan, where the World Trade Center and the financial district is.
Exactly.
So the Manhattan Island is a pretty sizable island. It's a couple miles across and maybe 15-20 miles long, north to south, something like that. Yeah. And of course, it's packed with people. It's one of the most populated places on the planet. So, and we'll kind of get into some of how that impacted things that day for you as well, of course. So talk to us, you're there early for breakfast. And of course, we all know, everyone is very well aware of what happened that day, and the timing of it was in the morning. So talk to us about how things progressed from that breakfast into where you first learned about what was going on and what was happening in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, so I got back to the office. I don't know, it must have been just after 8 o'clock or so, after my breakfast meeting, kind of working through my emails, getting hundreds of emails a day and spam and everything. And then I got a message from one of the guys I was having breakfast with, telling me that a plane had hit one of the towers. And initially, I kind of thought he was joking, but I recalled that somewhere long ago, a small plane had hit the towers before. So I was like, oh, maybe this is an accident. What's going on? So I called him right back and said, hey, let's go meet in the conference room where we can turn on the TV and watch the live coverage from the Today Show from NBC just below us. And so
right. To be clear, Chuck, at this point, you wanted to see what's going on, but you and like many people, pretty much everyone, like you said, a plane previously, I think even back in the 70s, right after the World Trade Center was finished, a small plane, just like a commuter plane hit the towers, no big deal. But, a single plane hitting the towers, they're very tall buildings. It could happen. So you, like most of us, were thinking at that point, maybe it was just an accident. You weren't thinking of something awful.
Yeah, because
right.
Yeah, exactly. Because even the Empire State Building has been hit by a plane in the fog.
Right,
right. It's actually, something that happens accident-wise. And so, but we wanted to see what's going on, and we're right above the Today Show. We have this great conference room with the live TV. And so it's like, let's go see what's going on. Like, this isn't a big, huge news event. And it's our city. We're right here. And so we went in and we were there within just a couple minutes. You can already see on the news coverage smoke coming from, really high up, because I think it hit really high up. Those towers are about, I think, 110 floors. And I think it hit somewhere in the 90s, the North Tower. And so you couldn't see like a big, huge jet hanging out of it. You know what I mean? Per se, when you just saw the smoke, right? And so we're sitting there watching. Some other people are hearing the news or coming also into the conference room. We're all kind of glued to the TV, and they're getting more angles of what's going on there. At that point, I don't think they had any replays or anything going to show that the scale of the accident yet. And then it seemed like almost just a couple minutes after we were watching it, but it was about, I think, 15 minutes after we kind of were watching it, just I think right after 9 o'clock, if I recall correctly, that we saw, because all the cameras are pointing there,
right
downtown with those views, we saw the impact of it looked like a big plane hitting the other tower.
Right. So the North Tower was hit first at 8:46 a.m.
Yeah.
And that was that was what you didn't see that live. Of course, that's what your coworker called you about. And then you started watching the TV a few minutes later. And then, like you said, pretty quickly, just maybe 10, 15 minutes later, after you started watching in that conference room at 9:03 a.m. is when the South Tower was hit by a second jet.
Yeah.
And so it was 15 minutes apart, basically. I mean, that's,
it seemed like boom, boom, almost, because we were just starting to watch the coverage.
Right.
Everyone's sitting there talking, speculating what's going on. And then it was almost unbelievable, like you're watching a movie, that you see this plane hit the other tower, and they immediately rewind it and put it in slow-mo almost. And you can see that it is a large jet.
Yep. Twin engine, right.
And it was lower, and it was like more like, it was like blatant. And the tone, everyone was kind of immediately, I think, in shock. Like for a minute or two, like, what are we seeing? This is very, very unusual. It's almost like, are we getting punked? What is going on? It's like, is this like the old War of the Worlds where people are hearing like, stuff over a, radio, and they're just conning everyone? What is going on? It was just so unbelievable, because it is like, you look at these two towers, especially working there for so long, they are like permanent. You kind of thought them as like the modern day version of the pyramids, right?
Right.
Them like being hit. And it only took probably a couple minutes for people, like, it became obvious that what's going on here is we're under attack.
Right. We didn't know from who at that point. Right.
It's not an accident.
Right.
Somehow planes are hitting New York City at the kind of, our biggest monuments are being hit and attacked. If it happened at 9:03, I'm saying around 9:05, people were like very, clearly understood what was going on. Now is a question of, what are we going to do? What is appropriate? How are we going to react? Because there were, other like senior managers, kind of O-level managers. At the time, I was the chief knowledge officer in charge of technology and process at my company. So I was one of them. And we're like, what are we going to do? People are still coming in. I was working for a creative company, so a lot of people came in late, but there was some early people there. We're sitting there trying to figure out what to do. There was other people in there. You could already sense that they were feeling some panic. There was other people that are obviously still in shock, maybe a little bit, because everyone processes things differently at a different pace.
Right.
But there are also people that were saying, we're responsible here. This is our company. What are we going to tell the people that work for this company to do next?
Right. And Americans, Chuck, we have the luxury because, this country has a lot of strength, a lot of resolve, and the world's strongest military and so forth. And we are very fortunate in this country. It's not a third world country. And other than, I think maybe the closest thing would be something like an earthquake. Other than an earthquake, or, a natural disaster, which is sudden. So a hurricane, we know it's coming. Wildfires, you have a little bit of warning. Tornadoes as well to some degree, but earthquakes are very sudden. Other than earthquakes, Americans, we don't deal with this sort of thing normally. This doesn't happen where we're dealing with a large scale disaster. In this case, man-made, very insidious and so forth. But so a lot of us aren't ready for it. Like you said, people are in shock and so forth. And to your point of at 9:03, when the South Tower, when the second tower was hit, anyone in that room with you or anyone in the world that at that point was still wondering what was going on, was it purposely an attack or an accident? Well, at 9:37 in the morning, I think at that point, everything was very clear and there should be no wondering, no, thoughts that it may not be an attack. At 9:37, at that point in time, 6-7 billion people alive on this planet, all of us knew that this was an attack because at 9:37, the Pentagon was hit by a third plane.
Yeah, and we were already starting to act by then, and that was just like further additional confirmation. But the group I was in, and New Yorkers per se, they're super savvy. They're not naive. Everyone around me, there's people a little in shock and a little bit panicked. Everyone knew this was probably most likely a major terrorism attack because we've lived through, New Yorkers have lived through other terror attacks down at, the towers there.
Yeah. The truck bombing. Right.
The truck bombing. And obviously it's like New York City is a super huge media mecca. And so any terrorist has to be one of the spots that they would want to go after. So once I again, very quickly, we were trying to set up phone calls and calling people, and people were calling us, and we were already kind of in the planning mode of trying to get people off the island because you could see I'm not sure exactly when you started seeing people walking over like the Brooklyn Bridge and all that kind of jazz, but it wasn't too far before and too much after. It was obvious when we got reports that the Pentagon was hit. But when the Pentagon was hit, it kind of ratcheted up a huge notch of, wait, how they hit the Pentagon? And that was at the point too where it's like, how vulnerable are we? Is this like Pearl Harbor, vulnerable? Like, how do we miss this coming? But that didn't necessarily change the sense of urgency. It just drove it like a stake inside your body that this is legit and we got to wake up and get going with whatever's happening next. And you could already tell based off conversations coming into the newsroom at NBC that they were already speculating what other potential soft targets could be hit next, thinking in terms of buildings, buildings. And they were thinking Rockefeller Plaza, Empire State Building. Everyone started very quickly, rattling off all of these spots that could be hit. And that kind of set off, I think, potentially some additional panic to get going.
Yeah. Now, Chuck, so a couple things here. So at 9:37, when the Pentagon was hit, kind of in this kind of time period we're talking about now, where you're at in New York City at 10 Rockefeller Plaza there, both towers, both World Trade Center towers were still standing.
Yes.
Now, for me, I am from New Jersey. New York City is my quote unquote hometown. I grew up 30 miles from New York City. I was there almost every weekend. That's my city. And so this day certainly affected me very personally, as it did many thousands, millions of people. So, again, some more than others had more familiarity or more connection to New York City, or the Pentagon for that matter. But I was living at this point in time in Southern California, in San Diego. So I was 3 hours behind in terms of when I'm waking up and whatnot. And now when I woke up, it was a little bit later, and we're not quite there in terms of sort of the time frame here, we're trying to kind of go linearly. But I wanted to touch upon something you mentioned, because I'm curious, because at this point in time, you're kind of thinking about, you're talking with your coworkers and whatnot there about what to do, how to get out of the city. You mentioned about people walking across the bridges, seeing that on television. Now, people know there are New York City, Manhattan specifically, where this is happening. It's an island. Again, we talked about that earlier. Because it's an island, literally it's an island, there are only three ways to get off that island: by boat, by tunnel, or by bridge. And that could be, by tunnel and bridge could be a train, could be a car and whatnot. Now, the Brooklyn Bridge, forget about 9/11, any day of the week, it is a unique bridge in that it's got on the left and right side of it is where the cars go. And in the middle of it is this very wide area where people can walk, and that they can walk all the time. So you mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge specifically, but as I recall, at some point that day, the other bridges, the dozen plus bridges that connect Manhattan to New Jersey to the west and Brooklyn and Queens to the east, people were walking across those bridges. But at this point in time, this early in the morning, Chuck, were cars still being allowed across the bridges, or was it just people, to your knowledge?
Yeah. What I remember is that within the city, there was still car traffic, okay, early in the process. But what we started hearing, that they were going to close the bridges and tunnels to car traffic and to train traffic.
Right.
And so they were shutting down the subways because they weren't quite sure if there were sleeper cells they were speculating everything. There was sleeper cells that could have been on subways. There could have been car bombs going over bridges or in tunnels.
Right.
So they started locking down the island from that kind of threat very, very quickly, because again, I think that the leadership in New York City was looking at all possible eventualities, because if they were that bold, be able to hijack planes and aim them into buildings and even hit the Pentagon, what else could be going on? And so I know that was their reaction. And so it's great that you can walk the Brooklyn Bridge, but that wouldn't have helped us much at all get back to New Jersey.
Right. It's the other way, right? The other direction.
Well, because, going that direction, going west, the George Washington Bridge is really, really far away.
And it's the only bridge to New Jersey.
Yeah. Again, my initial idea was, I'm hoping the ferries are going to be taking people over there. That's our best bet, I'm hoping. Otherwise, we're going to have a long trek up to the bridge, and who knows how that's going to go down. But yeah, it's that all those things were in my mind soup at that time when I was trying to figure out, not only making sure the people that I was responsible for had a plan, how was I going to get out the island, which kind of leads to another major concern of mine at the time, is that my brother-in-law was in the city at that time with one of his colleagues. And I knew the day before he was downtown. I had no clue what I was going to do and how I was going to deal with that whole other issue.
Yeah, now that's very interesting, Chuck. And not to make light of this, but just to kind of set the perspective. You and I have had a number of conversations in person, on the phone, and text message over the past couple of years since we've gotten to know each other. And one of the things that we've shared with each other is we have a lot in common. One of those things is we both like dystopian movies, sci-fi movies, and so forth. And certainly one form of a dystopian movie, if you will, set in current times usually, is your Dean Devlin, Roland Emmerich disaster movie, like The Day After Tomorrow, Independence Day, and things like that. Though usually what happens in those is it's centered around a family or a couple groups of people, and something happens. And then there's these additional complications because those people have other people somewhere else, maybe even close to wherever it is that happened. and they've got to go take care of them. So what you're unfolding here, Chuck, and this really points to the seriousness of this and the emotion, the fear, and so forth, which we'll get into later. I know that's a big part of what we want to talk about here. There's so much here. It sounds like one of those movies, and that really points to the intensity of all of this.
Yeah, exactly. Because one of the things that was top of mind for me is I'm not leaving this island without my wife's brother, right? I cannot leave until I get him wherever he's at. He doesn't know the city as well. He's not used to the city. He's younger. I got to find him no matter what. However long it takes, I've got to find him.
Yeah, and also to set the stage, because some of our listeners are younger listeners. Again, this is something that happened 20 years ago. This is 2001. In 2001, the second generation cell phone networks were just getting started. The first digital phones and digital capable phone service and cell towers, et cetera. This is just about 5 years or so ish after when cell phones started to become mainstream. So we're not talking about today where we have social media, we had internet capability with our phones. We were lucky we could text back then. And so, very primitive wireless communication services. So obviously, Chuck, you have enough of a challenge just in terms of how am I going to get off this island that's being locked down? And we should make it clear, by the way, again, for our listeners, that the island of Manhattan was not getting locked down because they were trying to keep everyone on the island or keep people off the island. It was about preventing additional damage. Again, there have been repeated attempts with truck bombs, for example, to take out the bridges in New York City, especially the George Washington Bridge, because that's the only bridge to New Jersey. And Rudolph Giuliani, who was the mayor at the time of New York City, who did a great job that day, and his team and all President Bush at the time, leaders and so forth, they were again, they had to react quickly. And I think overall there was a lot of good job done here. But here in the leaders of Manhattan, again, Giuliani, et cetera, they acted quickly, shutting down the trains, the subways, the bridges, the tunnels, because the tunnels, there have been attempts to attack the tunnels too. And of those attacks, one would just reap even more fear amongst thousands, amongst millions of people, but also literally could kill hundreds, if not thousands. Any of the bridges, people walking across the bridges, people driving across the bridges. The George Washington Bridge, for example, it's, I think, 3 or 4 lanes each direction, each side, but it's 2 levels. There's 2 levels of traffic. It's a huge bridge. Lots of cars and trucks and buses can be on it. So a lot of damage could happen, to human life. So
and a lot of people believe that if they would have attacked the bridges, especially that bridge, that would have even done more damage to the economy, to the psyche, to almost everything. They picked the easy target because the buildings are so big. But all those things were really top of mind for all the people in charge of anti-terrorism in the U.S. and specifically New York and New York City. And so that's everything ground to a halt. They weren't telling people to stay there, saying get off the island however way you can, but they had to deal with these major targets because information was limited. And you can imagine when they're kind of going through their planning process and they see that the Pentagon was hit, they're probably like, no way, how did that happen?
Yeah, one of the nation's most protected, safest buildings, most critical buildings to our Department of Defense. I mean, and again, that was a very symbolic target by the terrorists that day, of course.
Yeah.
In that way. Yeah.
But yeah. And so that was definitely something that was part of the situation and trying to figure out how we going to get off this island, because you couldn't just take the normal approach by any means.
Right.
And further complicating it, that I had to go find a needle in a haystack. And I wasn't sure exactly if we'd be able to coordinate. I remember Michelle, my wife, she was commuting to AT&T where she was working where she was working at the time. And when she found out, and so I started communicating with her and she started trying to communicate with her brother. We were trying to see if we could square up a meeting place. And the most obvious meeting place was Rockefeller Plaza right there above the ice skating rink. That was a major, major thing that we lucked out, is that cell coverage was working and was okay during that. We didn't have the ability just let's start sending texts or check social media or anything like that. Because again, these were basic flip phones, and you could get away with some of that, but it wasn't necessarily consistent. So, the limited cell technology we had was helpful, but I can only imagine what would have happened if we wouldn't have had that limited technology even then.
Right. Yeah. And actually, and to that point, Chuck, and I hate to think like this, but you can imagine if September 11th didn't happen and those towers are still up today, if terrorists, the same group, Al Qaeda, for whomever it may be, were to try this now, I hate to say this, but I bet what they would do is, the same targets, okay, fine, but they would also do a cyber attack at the same time to try to take down the power grid, trying to take down the cell networks, the internet, social media, because that right there, while that doesn't kill any people directly at all, just those cyber attacks can be even more dangerous because of the hysteria and panic and so forth that it can create. And there's been movies about that and so forth. So Chuck, before we get into further about you getting in touch with your brother-in-law and how you were able to get to safety and get him to safety and so forth, I really would like to understand, especially given the mission of our podcast here at Coaster Challenge, take us through what was going through your mind through this, in this, late, almost 9 o'clock, heading towards 10 o'clock. Both towers have been hit. They're both standing. The Pentagon's been hit, as we've been talking about. I mean, we don't, thank God, we don't deal with these things every day. These are hopefully what are once in a lifetime events. This is Pearl Harbor 2.0 happening. People, we don't deal with this every day. We don't deal with this. Some people don't ever deal with this in their lives. So this is unprecedented. This is next level fear. This is real fear. These attacks are happening. Thousands of people are dying, many of them instantly when those planes hit. So take us through what was going through your mind, the fear you're experiencing, how you were dealing with it, what you were concerned about, and how, most importantly, really, and the positive kind of other end of this, how do you rise to the occasion to power through it mentally in your head?
Well, it's definitely not like a live shooter event like you potentially experience and you've heard of today, where you're in a bar or a club or even in a classroom and you start hearing gunfire.
Right.
So that's one thing. Big picture, when I was there, what's critical, no matter what kind of live situation you're experiencing, and again, whether it's something like this or a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever else, is somehow you've got to convince yourself as quickly as possible that it's going to be okay, because you need to get beyond any potential panic or shock, which is usually, and I was a little in shock. I wasn't panicked, but I wasn't in shock because I wasn't quite sure what I was seeing on TV. It just didn't seem real.
Surreal, right.
Yeah, and because I think I've told you before, but I used to also live right across from the Twin Towers in Paulus Hook in Jersey City, right there behind the Colgate clock. And I used to walk to the PATH train at Exchange Place, which is right across from the Trade Center there in the Twin Towers. And so that was during when I was in an internship, and I would see it every day, just like the Statue of Liberty. And I'd see Statue of Liberty, and it's our freedom. And then you see our market might, and it's like a monument to our capabilities in the Twin Towers.
Right.
And so there was some real emotion there where it just didn't seem real. And then, but a couple of seconds later, and it's like, and this is what's critical, it's like, well, what does this mean? Because now you're in an unknown situation. And that's where, in my head, I remember saying to myself, it's going to be okay, right? And to give a little background, at that point, I'd had military training.
Okay.
So, pretty much all the males in my family in my past have served and been in Vietnam and been in World War II. And so, I went infantry and it was part of the reserve, so I could go complete my boot camp during the summer months. And I did that when I was between years in college. And so I had infantry training down in Fort Benning, Georgia in the Army. And so I had some training, and a lot of times what they tell you is you got to remain calm, but that's easier said than done.
Right. In a situation like this.
But
right.
When you're dealing with live fire in those scenarios and all the training and all these different people trying to focus on staying alive, just surviving boot camp, remaining calm and somewhat collected is important. But still, when you're faced with this situation, it's, you kind of have to go through these steps, kind of like denial and acceptance and like being mad or angry or whatever it's going through, that you got to get yourself where you're thinking, right? And a huge part of that is also helpful is breathing. A lot of people hold their breath in these kind of situations, and oxygen feeds your brain, and you need your brain to kind of come with a plan. I was kind of just trying to do that, and then very quickly assessing the situation. My assessment at that time, even though there's all these rumors, just knowing how these situations can sometimes bring out the best in people, it could also bring out the worst in people.
Right.
You know, because a lot of people, you know, they use their imagination in the worst case scenario. They imagine the worst because they're fighting shock and they're afraid. And so I was kind of fearful of that chaos. Not that I didn't think like people in New York and that New Jersey people and all that couldn't rise to the occasion, but I was thinking it's very possible that this could get out of hand very quickly. I was not afraid of being shot. It wasn't helpful to be afraid of a plane hitting me, because what can I do to avoid that? And so I said, I just got to figure out a way to come with a plan to see if I can get off the island. Because if I can get off the island, there's probably gonna be less chaos off the island than on the island. And seeing all these movies, these dystopia kind of end of world scenarios, you just see all these people yelling and screaming and leaving and just going wacko and just chaos. And you started seeing some of that on the TV even then, that like people were confused, like the anchors were confused. They were in shock. They were like these hardcore New York people were just like, what's going on? And you could see fear and you can hear fear in their voices.
Yes, I remember that.
And so I was like, if these professionals are feeling this way, what are the citizens that are on the island right now feeling? That's what I was afraid of, is being in one of those circumstances, having to deal with people that are panicked or in shock, and having to kind of make my way through that to come up with some way to get off the island. And so all that thinking and all that happened within like those first 5 minutes after we saw the second plane hit the tower, and it became very obvious that this day was going to be very, very unique day in the history of the U.S.
and the world, for that matter. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's definitely for Americans that are highly confident that we're not vulnerable. And it did have a feel of like a Pearl Harbor scenario, that somehow we were caught unaware and ill prepared. And how could we allow something like this to happen? And that's what it felt like. That's where I was, just those 5 or so minutes afterwards, kind of working through my emotions, my fear, and trying to get myself in a frame of mind to figure out what to do. And that's a luxury a lot of times people don't have, by the way.
Right. Like in an active shooter situation, you have seconds to deal with.
And that's that's something we go on later. But I'm saying those scenarios, you first got to say, hey, it's going to be okay. You got to somehow trick yourself into getting to a calm and more collected situation, making sure you're not holding your breath and breathing, so your brain can start assessing your situation and figuring out what you should do next.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Chuck, I'd like to unpack a few things you've said there. Some really good things you've mentioned. So first of all, one of the last things you talked about is, and I mentioned this earlier, and countless people right after September 11th, then the days, the weeks, the months, the years that have followed, have compared, as I did earlier and as you did, compared the attacks of 9/11 to Pearl Harbor. And I called it Pearl Harbor 2.0. And certainly there's some similarities for the scale and so forth. But one interesting difference, and you talk about your military training, is Pearl Harbor. It was you could look at it as a conventional act of war. Things like that have happened before, where one country will attack another country that is not at war with that other country at that point, and that brings them into war with each other. And that's what the Japanese did. They brought us into the war. They were compelled to. And there's geopolitical things that were going on in World War II that led them to that. And they primarily attacked military targets, and the majority of the thousands of people that died today were sailors and people in the military. Still very sad, very unfortunate. 9/11, though, was a completely different level, because the people that were attacked that day were just everyday citizens, men, women, children. Lots of children died that day. And that's the pain that we felt as a country, as a nation, and as a world. Many of our allies, countries that were typically against the U.S. or not very much allied with us, became allied with us, because on that day, it wasn't so much that we were U.S. citizens and there were British people and Iranians and Egyptians. We were just people on this planet, and these awful things were happening. And we were in that way, in a certain way, united because these awful things were happening. But in any case, going back to one of the first things you said in terms of how you were dealing with this, Chuck, you mentioned that you had to convince yourself and really focus on that things were going to be okay. And I just want to unpack that. My interpretation of what you're getting at there is really it's a binary situation. You can either say that things are going to be okay or that things are not going to be okay. Well, if you're going to go with things are not going to be okay, it's a defeatist attitude. You're giving in. You're not going to really want to make the best decisions or really fight to do the best things for yourself and the people that you're trying to help. Whereas if you say that things are going to be okay, you may not know. I mean, certainly that day, the sub 300 million Americans at that point in time, population of the country, normally most of us know we're going to make it through the day. Most likely we get hit by a bus. We could have a heart attack, but the vast majority of us are going to make it through. 9/11, all bets were off because now we know 20 years later, the two towers were attacked, the Pentagon was attacked, and a failed attack, thanks to Todd Beamer and other brave souls on board United 93, were able to prevent attack on the U.S. Capitol, either the White House or the Capitol building itself. Thank God they stopped that. Those are true American heroes, world heroes right there. But nonetheless, 4 planes were the weapons of choice that day. But we didn't know that day. No one knew that. This caught the CIA. This caught our military, our government officials, everyone, every citizen on this planet by surprise. 19 people and some other people that supported with Al-Qaeda, they knew what was going on. They knew the scope of it, but we didn't. And for all we knew, 10 Rockefeller Center, 30 Rock was going to be attacked. Statue of Liberty. I was in California, in San Diego. San Diego is a huge military city. We've got the Marine Corps at Miramar. We've got 32nd Street, Coronado. We've got one of the largest Navy bases on the planet. Most of the time, there's not one, not two, but 3 aircraft carriers stationed there. I mean, huge military target. I was concerned that San Diego was going to be attacked. The Golden Gate Bridge, Transamerica Pyramid, downtown LA, Hollywood, who knows? So many symbolic targets. So all bets were off. But to your point, Chuck, the best thing to do is you can't know if you're going to be okay, but you have to act as if you're going to be okay. Otherwise, you're just giving up. And so you have a choice of either giving up or let me act, let me move forward with the hope that I'm going to be okay. And let me do my best to make that happen. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Chuck?
Yeah, it's kind of the placebo effect where, soldiers on the battlefield that are really injured and most likely are going to die. The medics usually still go over to them and want to give them every chance. And they say, you're going to be okay. It's one of the things, first responders do is because if you're in shock or you're panicked and you're not calm, you're less likely to be okay, right? Because your body responds a certain way when it's calm and where you're deep breathing and your body's function as best as it can. But when you're holding your breath or when you're really afraid, everything gets tight. And you put yourself in kind of the worst case scenario, and you want to put yourself in the best case scenario. And even if you're seeing it over and over again, and it may not be okay, but the more you can tell yourself to do that, I think you're buying yourself time to maybe have options going forward that you wouldn't have had otherwise if you were panicked or not in a rational position or still in shock, because that's usually what happens is you just kind of go off the deep end in a lot of ways and you're no longer able to think clearly. And what happens, unfortunately, that panic is contagious. If you tell yourself, okay, you're okay, then you can start telling other people that they're going to be okay. And hopefully then they will keep telling themselves and then others that they're going to be okay. And then you can actually start together trying to make your situation better off than it would otherwise be. So you don't, again, create a whole crowd getting panicked. And I also want to make something really clear here too. Is my situation was extremely different than the people that were there that morning, the people that were very, very close to those Twin Towers downtown.
Right.
Their sense of urgency, what was going on there was literally second by second, decisions were being made, whether they were going to live or die. Some proud, brave souls took it upon themselves to really sacrifice themselves, not knowingly necessarily, but some of them kind of knowing when they were trying to help other people in those buildings, trying to help people around those buildings increase the chance of survival. And their situation was extremely different than my situation in Midtown, about 4 miles away, and everyone else off the islands. There was some little bit differences in the Pentagon, and definitely the people on that plane that just were able to sacrifice everything to make sure it didn't go into the White House or who knows where. And so I just want to make sure people understand that I was really, really lucky to be where I was on that day.
Right. Yeah.
And to have that much flexibility to make better decisions, where I don't know how I would have necessarily acted if I was in one of those buildings. I hope that I would have acted the right way, or how I would have approached the situation differently. I think that's important to say, because, my situation was more unique than yours, being in San Diego.
Right, of course.
Theirs was even more urgent. These people there on the scene, within blocks of that area, people in the building itself, all those, first responders charge into those buildings to help people. Their level of fear, anxiety, and how they reacted just had such a different level of fight and bravery and heroism than my situation.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And certainly it wasn't your situation, but to touch upon that, when we talk about fear, anxiety, panic, there is fundamentally a binary choice at each moment that we're going through that elevated event, that stressful event. Fight or flight. As you think about things, as you make decisions, consider options, it's fight or flight. Now, for you, it was one thing, and we'll certainly be talking more about that. But for the unfortunate people that were first and foremost in the towers, that were right down there, it wasn't just the Twin Towers that suffered. I mean, there were several buildings around there that were damaged as the events progressed that day, and so forth. All those people down there, fight or flight. The firemen, the hundreds of firemen, just the initial responders. I'm not talking about the literal thousands of firemen and first responders from all over the country, from all over the world, that were involved in the attempted recovery efforts to recover people out of the rubble in the days and weeks that followed. I'm talking about, and that was an incredible thing as well, even the dozens upon dozens, perhaps even hundreds of dogs that were involved in that, and the bravery of them and the sacrifice of them is a whole nother story. But just in this initial response, and this initial, as the towers were attacked and still standing at this point, early morning of September 11th, again, dozens upon dozens, hundreds perhaps of firemen that, again, in this scenario, I could understand why a fireman who is trained to have to be brave. I mean, they're dealing with some of the most dangerous situations a human being can be presented with, fire and smoke and so forth, that going to high heights and whatnot, that any human being may ever be presented with. But September 11th was a whole nother level. And I could understand why firemen that day, perhaps there were some that said, nope, I'm not being part of this 110-foot story building. No way. Two of these. Nope. Terrorist attacks. I'm out of here. But again, I think those are in the minority. So many of these firemen, they chose fight, and that's what they do. They're trained to fight, to not flight, to face any fear and anxiety, push it out of their minds, and then themselves say, I'm going to be okay. I have good training. I have great equipment. I have my teammates that support me, and I support them. We're going to make this happen. Now, the reality is that many of these firemen were fighting, but they probably knew, given the scope of things, especially after, what was it? I think 10:03 a.m., I believe it was, when the South Tower collapsed. 9:59 a.m., just a few minutes before. That right there, I think for a lot of people, really put us in a much more somber place, because then we were facing the stark reality of, oh God, these buildings, they're both going to collapse. This one of them already has, this other one's going to. So these firemen, especially after 9:59, going into the North Tower still, they could very well lose their lives. And so many of these brave heroes lost their lives that day because of it. Then we have the civilians that don't necessarily have that training, that are in the North and South Tower before they collapsed, above where the planes hit. And of course, we know the story there. Many of them, and scores of them, jumped to their deaths, and they chose flight. And you know what? I understand. I mean, that talk about hopelessness. These buildings still to this day they would be, if they still existed today, among the tallest buildings in this world, with those huge fires, that jet fuel still burning. there's no fire ladder truck that's going to get up there. Maybe helicopters could, perhaps. The chance of them surviving was very small. And as they're dealing with perhaps the impacts of the fires, of smoke inhalation, they wanted to end their lives quickly because they figured they were going to die. Now, those people, again, very unfortunate, the hundreds of people that were above the impact points on those towers. Thankfully, they were in the relative minority. Most of the people were below the impacts, and many did get out. Thank God. They jumped on those stairs and they got out of there, and the firemen helped. And there's some great stories of true heroes that day that succeeded as heroes. Heroes don't have to, heroes are not just heroes if they succeed. Heroes can be heroes just because they tried. And it's a huge thing to think about. But again, all this fight and flight going on.
Well,
now,
and just to add to that a little bit, to give additional context, the firefighters in New York City, Bravest crew out there, they're just amazing, because people were still going into that North Tower as that South Tower was going down.
Right.
And it's a little bit like, I try to compare it to, not that it's 100% this way, but people that in the military, when they go into a combat zone, that they know that they've significantly increased their risk of dying by being in this combat zone compared to if they were in a normal neighborhood environment or on base somewhere in the US. They know every day they're going to be in a position where that there's going to be a life and death consequences. Through proper training and through confidence of your platoon and your team and everyone else around you, kind of understand how you're going to be there for each other and what your mission is and how you're going to approach things. And I'm just imagining, which is almost impossible to really know, teams of firefighters knowing when they see what's going on and saying, you know what, this is the worst case scenario that we've trained for, but we're here for ourselves and for the people here in the city. Who else is going to increase the probability that people are going to survive this? They were the only ones that were willing to do this. And they took that responsibility to the highest level, because these aren't people that were just blindly following orders. You just don't blindly follow orders when you're in this situation.
You make the choice. Yeah.
And these are people with families.
Right.
That have kids, they have pregnant wives maybe, or husbands, and that care for them at home. And they're trying to save lives by putting their life on the line. Their families being altered permanently, but they took that job so seriously and so selfishly that they were like, you can only imagine the inner dialogue they're saying, you know what? They had to be telling themselves, I could still survive this. I'm going to keep saving people as long as I can. Because if they were brutally honest themselves, it's hard to kind of get through that. I'm just saying, I can only imagine that kind of hero mentality to say, I'm willing to pretty much jump on a grenade to save someone. Because that's what they were all doing, jumping on grenades when they kept going up and trying to save people, running it still into the North Tower trying to save people. It was just incredible. And 99.99% of the people in the US never have to really be confronted with that. But these people that the service members in combat zones, these firefighters, when they're dealing with these crazy situations, this is the craziest one. It's just unbelievable how they're able to marshal their emotional and mental facilities to just do something that just doesn't make sense to do normally for everyone else in the world.
Absolutely. And as tragic as September 11th was, and it was tragic, unprecedented, September 11th also was a day of heroes. And one of the things that I remember vividly, it's so uncanny, 8 days before September 11th, Enrique Iglesias, who was kind of a rising star, or kind of just getting started back then, he released an album which, amongst others, contained the track Hero. And I remember, and it's a great song, and it has a special meaning to me and millions of people. It became the anthem of because again, it wasn't just that day, it was the days, the weeks that followed, the recovery efforts, and then all the soldiers and so forth, and the response and the war on terror and so forth. These are all heroes. And it was so poignant and just crazy that song was released just 8 days before. Just crazy coincidence. But in any case, going back to the fight or flight, and you're talking about breathing. I did not experience a panic attack that day myself. I certainly had anxiety. I mean, millions of people, billions perhaps, had anxiety that day. Now, but I've experienced panic before. I've developed with 3 clinical depressions in my life, and the anxiety, the ping-ponging that goes along with that. As part of that, I've had panic attacks in those periods of depression. And yeah, I know what you're talking about. You stop breathing. You're just consumed with anxiety, consumed with worst case scenarios, and terror, personal terror. When we talk about the reverse of that, of not being in a panic attack or getting out of one or avoiding one, really the opposite, if you will, of panic attacks is mindfulness. And one of the chief ways to be mindful that you don't need any other tools for, any help with, is breathing. Is if you breathe, that is a mindfulness. You're focusing in your breathing that can keep you in the moment and not thinking about, for example, on September 11th, there's sort of this very recency type depression that can occur, was going on, thinking about what has happened. Oh my God, these thousands of people that have just been killed, and what our country is, what's going to happen with this, or what has happened already. But then the other part of it, and really what was a big thing for all of us that day, was the anxiety is, oh God, what else? What other attacks are going to happen? What is, how are we going to respond to this? How are we going to reconcile this? How are we going to recover from this as a nation, as a world? That ping-ponging, that huge, unprecedented being uncentered, if you will, is very dangerous. And especially for people in New York City that didn't know if they were going to be safe. To put things in perspective, in 2001, the population of Manhattan, that's just the people that live there, was 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people. And this is and that's not all of New York City. That's just Manhattan. That does not count the many tens of thousands, perhaps even over 100,000 people that come into Manhattan to work, to commute, like you did that day, for example, Chuck. There's so much at stake here, so many lives at stake, even beyond the people that were directly impacted in the towers and in the Pentagon as well, by the way. You talk about breathing. Breathing is the number one thing that people can do in extreme scenarios like this. And like you were saying earlier, talking about focusing on, I'm going to be okay. Or even if you could say, you know what, I can be okay here. I'm going to focus on being okay here. Because, maybe some people listening, trying to, think about, God forbid, things happening in the future they have to deal with like this, that, how can I say to myself, I'm going to be okay in a scenario like this? I get that. You could at least say, I'm going to focus on being okay here. I'm going to do everything I can to be okay here. And breathing deep breaths and not thinking about, oh God, what other attacks are going to happen? Or how many people are dying today? How is the world going to change? And all this uncertainty, which is the energy source of anxiety, is uncertainty. Is, thinking about those things, we can't know the future. And any day of the week, even on a good day, on September 11th, forget about it. We couldn't know the future that day. Absolutely not. It was unprecedented. Again, what you and I are talking about here, Chuck, trying to educate the audience and share with people, as you and I do, even on a personal level, just the two of us, being kind of philosophical and whatnot. These are things that are easier said than done, but takes training and practice. And
I kind of think in terms of like visuals sometimes, where kind of think of dominoes, right? And I've said this before, is fear and panic. That's like a failure of imagination. And so imagine every time you start entertaining these negative thoughts, it becomes this vicious cycle. But it's almost like your dominoes are falling. But every single time a domino falls, hits another domino, it's a bigger domino. And then the next domino is even bigger. And then the next domino is even bigger. And you kind of get yourself stuck in a hole because now the domino is going downhill. That's like a failure of imagination. You're thinking of the worst case scenario. You're lying to yourself in all the wrong ways through this kind of false imagination story. Now, when you tell yourself and you start breathing correctly, where you're not holding your breath, and you tell yourself it's going to be okay, the opposite happens. Dominoes start falling where it kind of takes you upstairs, and you start building yourself some momentum to think, right? Where you start thinking, hey, what can I control versus something realistic versus what I can't control that's completely unrealistic, right?
Right.
Like, oh, the sky is falling. I look, it's blue sky. The sky's not falling yet, right? I look around me and there's not fire. I don't hear shots. Okay?
Right. There's no immediate danger for
There's
you.
no immediate,
Right.
not that all scenarios are like that, but a lot of scenarios, people panic because they imagine that the whole world's going to cave in on them any second. And they ratchet it up, kind of creating this vicious cycle versus more of a virtuous cycle, which is trying to use your imagination in the right way. If you're going to imagine things like you will be okay. That's imagination.
Right.
You don't know for a fact that you're going to be okay. You're just going to imagine an outcome where you could be okay, right? And the more you convince yourself of that and deal with things in front of you, like second by second that you can't control, like, oh, I can't control my breathing right now. That's something I can control. I'm going to take a deep breath and let it out very slowly. I've just proven to myself now that I have control over something in this situation. And then you use that as some positive momentum to get you to the next moment, right? When you have moments. Because the first thing, if you're an active shooter scenario, it's different. We can talk that later. But in the scenario where you do have a second to breathe and tell yourself it's going to be okay, and then get to the next moment, you're giving yourself positive options. And that's where you can start using your brain, your logical brain, to start figuring out, well, what should I do next that I have control over?
Right. Exactly.
And that builds more that virtuous cycle where you gain steam. And just by saying, I will be okay, or telling someone else they're going to be okay, right? You have these little tiny moments of bravery. They're minute. They're tiny, tiny things, but you're building confidence. These tiny little things, like, something as simple as a roller coaster. I'm going to get close to the roller coaster. I'm going to stand in the queue and I'll go all the way to the end to see it. I'll build these little steps where I feel I'm building confidence. I will actually say out loud that I'm thinking about riding that roller coaster. All those things are positive movements. In a crazy scenario, a real fear scenario, you've just got to tell yourself, I'm going to make it another minute, another 2 minutes, another 3 minutes, whatever it may be, to actually be able to use your brain to kind of figure out a plan to what you really should do next to kind of help you, help people around you, and definitely at a minimum, not make it worse. But yeah, and that's why I'm just saying that fear is the start of panic. And then that's the start of chaos. And that's where you really start losing control kind of exponentially.
Yep. And it's hard to come back from that in the near term in these situations. So yeah, to your point, again, staying in the moment, breathing, which is keeping yourself in the moment and thinking about, okay, where I'm at right now, being situationally aware, what's going on, what do I know about the situation? Okay, this is going on a few miles away. It's awful, but okay, I acknowledge that, but I'm not going to think about that too much because I can't do anything about it. A few miles away, there doesn't seem to be anything going on here. Like you said, the active shooter analogy, but I need to get off this island because there's a lot of targets here. I want to get away from all the big targets as much as I can. Bridges and tunnels are closed. So you're again thinking about, okay, what are not my options, and figuring out what your options then are. And I think the big thing I want to take away from this, as far as what you were personally dealing with, Chuck, is your biggest concern was not necessarily another attack on Rockefeller Center, because if that's going to happen, then you're not going to be able to do much other than getting away from there, what you were planning to do. Your main concern was knowing the human psyche, human psychology 101, is how most people are going to react in a scenario, which unfortunately is not well. And you're in a city of 1.5 million people and tens or hundreds of thousands of people visiting town, schools there, people coming into town like yourself for work, commuting in. Talk to us about how you, keeping that in mind, your concerns there, how you proceeded. Here we know your brother-in-law's there, colleague as well. Talk to us about how you proceeded with those concerns in mind.
Well, get yourself in the right frame of mind. It's all about creating checklists, like a kind of a to-do item, like what do I need to do next? And checking those boxes kind of in your to-dos, like the next steps. And that's actually easier to focus on than everything that's just been going on. It's like if you can analyze saying, I didn't feel personally that I was under immediate threat, attack necessarily, but I knew that things could get out of hand very quickly. And so I wanted to figure out what I needed to do to make each next each next step happened. Talking to Michelle, knowing her brother, thank God, was not downtown, but was more uptown somewhere. His colleague was somewhere. He didn't want to leave without his colleague, who I hadn't met yet. She was somewhere south of Midtown, but we really didn't know. And so kind of through a telephone chain, I was talking to Michael through Michelle, because I was still trying to coordinate what was going on at the office. And this is all before 10 o'clock. Okay. So
right before the towers came down, right? Either of them. Right.
And at the same time, I was trying to figure out, like, is there anyone I'm going to be going with? Because it's always better, if you can, in these kind of slow going situations, to be with others. Kind of security in numbers, especially if things are going to get out of hand with people in panic. It's always better to have people that are with you. Just like in nature, the bigger of a group you kind of come across, the less likely people are going to kind of move in your direction and attack you. If you're just a single animal on the savannah, then you're kind of an open target, But, and so, a lot of animals, they look big, they make themselves look big, so they're not as an easy a target. So I had a friend who lived near me. I was like, you're coming with me. We'll get off together. So wherever you can find someone to kind of join your side, and someone who's not panicking, they can help reinforce you as well and say, it's going to be okay. Yeah, it's going to be okay. And all that kind of common thinking helps support each other. And so
it's two minds are better than one.
Yeah. Right? And so, but I was telling him, it's like, I have my brother-in-law here and he's got his colleague, and he wasn't necessarily excited about having to wait.
Right.
And so I was like, no, I got it covered. We're going to do it. So I'm just like selling him on waiting, and it wouldn't be bad if we had some, other people with us. I got to get him. It's Michelle's brother. And thank goodness, really quickly thereafter, probably a good 10, 15 minutes into all of this, they were both there. First her brother, and then we were looking at our watches. We're going to have to go. I'm hoping she's just going to be here soon. His colleague showed up, and I'm just kind of thinking roughly the time frame. It was probably around 9:45 or so.
Yeah.
In that, once the first tower was hit, Michelle was getting word, and she thought it was potentially an accident. But the first thing she was thinking about, knowing the locations, like, where was her brother? Because she had no clue.
Right.
He was maybe downtown. And so she'd already been in the line with him, and he had already said that his colleague was somewhere. And so when the second plane hit, and I was connecting with Michelle saying, I'm okay, but we're going to try to get off. Everyone's going to be going home, and I'm going to be going with Kit, my friend. And she knew Kit. It's like, my brother, where should you meet? And I was like, Rockefeller Plaza. And so things were happening minute by minute. And somehow they were able to make their way to Rockefeller Plaza. As soon as they were there, I was like, okay, we're going this way. Stay with the plan. And the goal was to head west to direction New Jersey, get to potentially get a ferry, right, across the river.
And
right?
Chuck, if I could stop you. Yeah. So basically you're going to try to go west, like you said, not use the George Washington Bridge, because that would be, a good 7 miles away. Walking, because you can't use the subway. The subways are not operational at this point. And so you were just doing the quicker, kind of shorter walk, half a mile or so, because Manhattan's not really that wide. It's much longer, and get over to the ferry, try to get a ferry. But before we get to that, I'm just curious, have you ever, whether it be back, shortly thereafter, or in the past, anytime in the past 20 years, have you thought about what you would have done here? Because you have the unique situation. A lot of people that day, it was just themselves. They drive into Manhattan or take a train in, they're by themselves. They may have coworkers, but they're just going to get themselves out of there. Their families back home in New Jersey, Connecticut, or wherever it may be, commuters and whatnot. But you have this unique situation where you're like, I need to get my brother-in-law. I am not leaving without him. Again, like that disaster movie scenario, which creates the additional plot lines and whatnot. Have you thought about what you would have done if, as we all were probably thinking was going to happen, we couldn't use the cell networks? They were busy, overloaded. Have you thought about how you would have handled things if you couldn't get through to him?
Yeah. First of all, I would have been in a position where I would have had to tell my friend, just go on without me.
Right.
That would be it. And then I would have not left the island until I knew for a fact that Michael was off the island. I would have stayed in place because it was a central location, easy to find.
Right.
And if you've ever been in New York City, there are places that are obvious. This is one of the most obvious places to be, is Rockefeller Plaza at the ice skating rink.
Right.
It's such a focal point. And I would have stayed there until he would have showed up, because he knew where I worked for a fact. And I was hoping, and if he wouldn't have been able to get in contact with Michelle, that because we had a pretty good relationship, he would have, my assumption was, unless he was told otherwise by certain officials, he would have tried to make his way there.
Right.
And
Right.
I was not going to leave him hanging. And so
Good for you.
So I would have been there. I'd probably been in front of the Today Show, and somewhere like right there at the corner, because there's that corner right there at the Today Show.
Right.
I
Right.
could actually see over to where the ice skating rink was at one level lower, so I could at least orient myself to see that. And I would have been looking in all directions nonstop every minute thereafter, waiting for word or waiting to see him. The only unfortunate question that was hard to answer is if he did ever eventually get there and we had no way of figuring out a way to coordinate to find his friend.
Right.
Right. What would we have done at that point? And I would have had to trust Michael's judgment to a certain extent based on his understanding of what his friend would do, how we'd approach it. Because normally, even outsiders kind of probably had an inkling that they had to figure out a way off the island. New Yorkers are just, a lot of the more New Yorkers are going to like, hey, there are people that are going to help and say, just come with me. Oh, I got to meet up with someone. No, you'll never find them. Needle in a haystack. If you can't contact, you can't call them. They may already be off the island. And so kind of going through those scenarios, at what point do I try to get him safe and keep waiting? Because Michelle was highly anxious about the whole situation.
Oh, of course. I mean, we all were. Yeah.
So she was kind of thinking more worst case scenario than, oh, it's going to be okay. I was telling her it's going to be okay. And, she was not okay with the situation, me being, because she knows Manhattan really well. And she knows there's not a lot of ways off the island, and that worst case, I could be stuck there for a while, where I'd have to go all the way up to George Washington and walk the bridge. And then who knows how long that would take, and the chaos surrounding, crossing the bridge. Because at this point in time, when we're heading over to, the Hudson River to get across over to New Jersey, no one knew at that point what we were going to find along the river.
Right.
No one knew if we could get across the river from there. I knew that was my cut. I was going to go there first and assess the situation, because I was half imagining not positive stuff. I was thinking, what if people are just jumping on to these boats and just overloading them? And who knows, people getting into fights to get on them, kind of thinking about like the Titanic, people trying to get on.
I was just thinking that.
Life preservers, just jumping and going all crazy. And who cares about women and children first? I'm getting on. So I was playing that back and forth in my head in that best case scenario when we were starting to head out away from Rockefeller Plaza. And so, but up until that point, thinking about how I was going to approach this, I couldn't have had a luckier situation happen for me. Everything worked the best way possible.
Yeah. And in a way,
at that point in time, I was able to coordinate a meeting point. The meeting point happened really timely, because depending on where these guys were, no way it could have taken an hour to get to me. Right. And all that. They could have got confused, turn around. It's not like people had just like easy maps. And you could just pretty logical still there, but you could be going the wrong way for all you know for a while, and then get confused and disappointed, and who knows what could have been going on. So it couldn't have gone better up until that point in my mind.
Yeah, and also we didn't. This is before GPS, at least civilian GPS. I think at that point some military GPS satellites were in use and in orbit, but again, this is before GPS units were available. This is long before smartphones and the and mobile internet. But, in a way, like you said, you were in a good position, much like we kind of compared a little bit here today with the natural disasters, like say a hurricane, where people, when they get evacuated, they're not going hundreds of miles away. At least when they go to evacuation centers, if they're told where to go by authorities, they go a few miles away, a few miles inland away from the ocean and whatnot. So you were a few miles away from where these attacks happened. So you were not, as we talked about earlier, immediate danger. It's not like you were in one of the World Trade Center towers, in the first few floors. Obviously, in that scenario, you would have, I'm sure, gotten out of there, and whatnot. And then I don't think anyone was going to stay in those buildings. If a building is on fire, you get out. I mean, that's just a common human survival 101. But yeah, thank you. I just was curious, kind of the what if kind of things that you were going through there. So meanwhile, so you're proceeding, your brother-in-law, his coworker, you've got this kind of friend of yours, coworker, that's kind of this big burly guy, kind of protective, smart guy, level-headed. So you got your team and you're headed west towards the various ports, the various piers and whatnot that line the Hudson River along the west side of Manhattan. And how long did it take you to walk over to where?
Well, it's actually not so close. I kind of looked at it again. It's over a mile.
It's over a mile. Okay.
To get there. And I remember it took us, we were going at a good clip because I wasn't sure exactly what was going on. And I'm a fast walker.
Right. Me too. Yeah.
And so I was like, we got to get there as soon as we can, because I have no idea. I was preparing everyone for the worst a little bit. And I have no idea what we're going to find when we get there. So the sooner we can figure out what's going to happen next.
Right.
And
time is of the essence. Right.
Yeah. And so we hauled over there, and I don't imagine it took us more than 15 minutes. It was less than 10. But by the time we got there, it had to have been after 10 o'clock.
Right.
We could see significant smoke coming from downtown. From that angle, I keep trying to remember what we could actually see. And if you remember, Manhattan's kind of has an elbow.
Right.
Between there and downtown. So it kind of like curves in. And so from that perspective with the smoke, I don't necessarily recall being able to see it per se, but in my mind, sometimes I do see it, but I don't know how real that was necessarily. But I just remember seeing the smoke and finding out that the first tower fell.
This actually was the second tower that was hit, the South Tower, right?
But I'm saying the first tower had fell.
The first
I know it's the second one. Because again, if you remember, the second tower that's hit was hit lower.
Right.
Right. And I think that was a big situation where that may have caused the draining of all that, filling of all that fuel, may have been able to deteriorate the building faster than the one that was hit up higher, maybe. I have no idea. But
well, my guess is, and I'm an engineer. I'm not a civilian engineer. All disclosure here for our audience. But since that one was hit lower and you've had this impact, all that jet fuel, super high temperatures, where it could even burn the steel core of these buildings. And again, just a quick aside, the World Trade Center, which was completed in 1973, I believe, it was built took about 5 or so years to build them. They were the skyscraper Titanic of their day. The way they were built, there was this new way to construct buildings, super tall buildings. They were built and architected in preparation for a plane to hit them. Not necessarily purposefully, but because of how tall they were, a plane could hit them. And so that was part of the design process. There's been all this aftermath, all these studies, but, they maybe didn't consider the jet fuel and how high temperature it burns at, blah, 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 blah. But bottom line is my guess as to what happened here is because that South Tower was hit at a lower height and you've got all this core right there of that building getting burned, you had more weight up above that was no longer being supported because that core at that height was being burned and melted away. And they had more material, more building, more floors of building above that started coming down and a higher level of weight where it just collapsed quicker. That's my theory. But whatever the case may be, the South Tower came down at 9:59 a.m. Now, when you left 10 Rockefeller Center, you gave up your instantaneous availability of information. Because again, this is before mobile internet. This is just digital. Cell phones had just come out. We barely had text messages. You didn't have your TV. I'm assuming you didn't have a portable TV with you. Those are even kind of rare. How did you know in that moment, seeing that smoke at just after 9:59 a.m., that the South Tower had collapsed.
Well, you could see the smoke because smoke rises.
Right.
And the people, okay, let me just set the stage here.
Sure.
So we get there, pretty much people know that kind of shoreline there, if you call it that. Right in that area, a lot of people know the Intrepid Kennedy Museum, kind of aircraft carrier there.
Right, World War II, yeah.
Yeah, just north of there's all these piers. And so it's between like that, like 45th to like 55th Street, there's all these piers there. That's where we were kind of heading, hoping to, we didn't know what we would see when we got there. But once we got there, we saw a huge queue of people in lines.
Right.
Like ferry service to go across. And it looked like all the ships that were kind of marshaled over there were ferrying people over to kind of the Weehawken or, New Jersey side. Because that's
like Hoboken over there, right?
Just north of Hoboken's Weehawken.
Right.
And because it kind of goes Jersey City and then Hoboken and then I think Weehawken. There's all these boats there. And so once we got there, we knew that, okay, this looked like a promising situation. We're probably just going to have to wait.
Right.
And so we got into that queue like right away. Right when we got in the queue, you could start still looking downtown and people are talking, rumors, everything. And people are saying it's kind of hard always to understand that the smoke flumes, but everyone at that time was saying one of the towers have fallen. We didn't know what tower.
Right, of course.
Because of the way the smoke reacted, because it was different kind of smoke versus the smoke of the burning, the fuel kind of coming out, cycling up versus when it fell, a different kind of plume of smoke, I think, went up and not just out. And so that was our assessment at the time, given everyone that was there and they were talking and everyone, just kind of crazy. Some people were kind of in shock. Some people were still a little bit panicked. Some people were kind of more calm, collected. Just like in a queue for a coaster, there's switchbacks. And so you're talking to all these different types of people as you're going through switchbacks. Somewhere along that queue, it was obvious. It was almost like, if people know the movie Dunkirk.
Yep, great movie. Yep, Christopher Nolan, masterpiece.
All these boats like trying to get people from the shoreline. It looked like all of these boats, private boats and probably small ones and big ferry lines, they were all taking people over to New Jersey, which was really incredible. I'm not sure if that story was ever really told, but again, it wasn't wartime per se, but it was really cool that there was no kind of like, oh, we're going to charge you, or, oh, I'm not in the mood, or no, we're not going to do that because it's not official or something. Everyone was saying, we are going to help you. So,
and to clarify, Chuck, like Dunkirk, which Dunkirk was, it's a tremendous story. And I love that Christopher Nolan, who's one of my favorite cinematic storytellers, directors, and writers and so forth, how he was, told that story in such a creative way in seconds, minutes, and hours with three different stories intertwined. That's kind of a theme, it seems like, with us when we talk about seconds, minutes, and hours here as well. That was very instrumental in World War II in the earlier days for the British. And in many ways, if Dunkirk didn't happen, the war might have gone a different way, quite frankly, because thousands upon thousands of soldiers were saved to fight another day by many civilian boats, by hundreds of civilian boats, I believe. In your civilian modern day Dunkirk there on September 11th, my understanding is that it wasn't just, there were certainly commercial passenger ferries that operate every day out of New York City, but these were civilian boats as well, right?
There were like all kinds of boats, right?
Wow.
What I recall, they were anyone that had a boat along that shoreline, all the way, I think, down to downtown, were ferrying people away from Manhattan.
Right, away from the target.
My chunk, again, is like 10 blocks, north-south blocks, where, again, starting at the Intrepid and going all the way through the Manhattan Cruise Terminal, which is a terminal.
Oh, yeah.
Boats. And a lot of those are kind of for pay boats and for special occasion boats and taxi boats, all different types of boats. But I just remember this huge queue. and we were being processed through. It was really incredible. And I was still a little bit in a haze because I think back at that time, and I was still really in this like over-prepared, just like high stakes, like what's going to happen next, right? Because I was still a little bit in shock, like I can't believe this is happening in New York City of all places.
Right. In the United States.
In this context, because when I was in the reserves and I was, still going to college, and I was training at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs near NORAD.
Right.
And we'd go do training there. And we were, during the first Gulf War, my unit was activated to go overseas for that first Gulf War.
Right.
The invasion of Kuwait way
Right.
back.
Oh, yeah.
We were one of the only infantry units that were prepared enough at the time, reserve infantry units that were deployed overseas as almost like a second round of attack, that they sent all the active duty over there first.
Right.
How things went. We ended up going to Germany, and I recall being there, and we were kind of part of it was fancy at the time, like, anti-terrorist reaction force. But most of the time when we weren't training for some terrorist action, because back then, if you remember, they were afraid that there was going to be this huge consequence where all these terrorists from Osama bin Laden and everything were going to go to Europe and start have all these bombs and car bombs and everything else. I remember having
some things happened. Yeah. Oh yeah.
I remember, on some of the U.S. Army bases, people that are already deployed overseas, we were there checking for car bombs for people coming into these areas where they had barracks and families lived. And I remember checking with the mirrors underneath that you've seen on TV.
Yep.
I was kind of a grunt, at the time, and I was still a college kid looking underneath stuff and like, where am I in the world? What am I doing? Flying around in helicopters, just as practicing, training for, we had to be deployed because something was attacked in Europe, and we were one of those people around to actually do that job. And I'm sitting there right there on the pier in Manhattan and looking over at New Jersey, thinking there's actual terrorists that are attacking not somewhere in the Middle East, not somewhere even in Europe, where we were afraid that for people in Europe to be attacked by terrorists, but in New York City. And so I still had all these thoughts and emotions going on in my head. What am I going through as I'm sitting there waiting in line, this really calm and collected line queue, waiting to get on a boat, and hearing that, that first tower fell. What do you mean the Twin Tower, 110? That doesn't make sense to me.
Right, indestructible, right.
And before we knew it, we were on a big, huge ferry boat and heading over, getting word now and seeing extra smoke downtown. Because once you're actually on the river there,
and the
you
Hudson,
start getting angles downtown.
Right, where it curves around, right.
And now you're trying to look for the towers, because
that's
like an oriented spot. When I lived in there for 7 years, and it's like when you're in Denver, Colorado, you always know where the mountains are.
Right.
You know where that is. And it's
an orientation.
Point of orientation. It's like something that'll never change. And that's the way New Yorkers, and even being there for only 7 years or less at that point, you're looking down there and like something's missing. It's hard to reconcile at that point. Cause I'm assuming by the time we got on the boat, it had already been about 10:30. And I think it was 10:28 when the North Tower fell.
Yes, the second tower fell at 10:28. Yeah.
Right. Seeing that. And at this point, and I have to mention this, there was you started having this smell where you're starting to smell smoke, and you're starting to smell some other smell that was very sour, kind of bitter. And that is like electrical burning smell, where you started having that smell, because again, we're not so far away at this point. We're probably no more than 4 miles away.
Right.
As the crow flies, you're getting this whole sense that, there's fire, and it's a unique fire smell, not like burning wood.
Right.
Like something else is burning. And you have to start thinking at this point, which I'm talking to other people after the fact, whether you accept or not, you're smelling, not to be grotesque, but you're smelling what's happened there.
Right. Which includes the burning bodies. Yeah.
Not that that's part of that's you're not differentiating that by any means.
Right. Right.
But
it's part of it.
For a fact that that's happened.
Right.
at that point, you have to also remember when you think about the Twin Towers, and if you were going to guesstimate, like how many people were in those towers,
right?
And you're thinking, how many people have just died during this time period? When I've been walking from Midtown at Rockefeller Plaza over to the pier, I've got on the boat and I'm heading over to New Jersey, to Weehawken, New Jersey. How many people have died? And that close to me, right? That close to where I'm at, right? Yep. Was something I wasn't mentally prepared to deal with at that time, but I was thinking, trying to reconcile them not being there and now really thinking, because you want to be positive, and I'm a really positive guy, and I always think about the most positive outcome in all situations.
Me too. Yeah.
The silver lining in anything and all things. Just being realistic, thinking if those towers fell, how many people lost their lives? And at that time, no one thought it was only going to be a few thousand people. No one.
Oh, yeah, I didn't. Yeah. Oh,
yeah. It's only going to be a few thousand. We were thinking it was in the magnitude of tens of thousands of people, right? Just because you overthink, you're just thinking, how many people work in that building? Because you're thinking of like floors. Are those kind of like blocks? Like how many blocks of people are in and you're not thinking like, oh, it's still early and maybe it's not late and maybe people escaped and maybe people got out there in time. You can't help yourself but thinking that so many people have just died, right?
Right. Now, Chuck, if I could just share some context to kind of give some numbers to what you're saying. Each of those towers was 110 stories tall. They were twin towers. They were the same height. Each of them, they were primarily offices. There was also the Windows on the World restaurant at the very top of one of the towers, but they were primarily offices, 99% offices. Each tower had the capacity to hold 50,000 workers. And these towers were largely 100% leased out. This is primo real estate. These were, as big as these buildings were, they were fully utilized at this point in time for the majority of their lifespan of nearly 30 years. So 50,000 workers each. In addition, again, the Windows in the World, the observation decks, about 200,000 people visited these towers every day. I mean, this just huge numbers of people were going in. And these are not just people going to the observation decks. These are people that don't work there. They're coming in out of those buildings, couriers, people delivering food. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth and whatnot. Each of these buildings, the material to construct them, the concrete, the steel, the asbestos, which I believe was also, and that's a big part of the problem with the people in the rescue efforts and people near there that were running away from there and things they inhaled and cancer and so forth that occurred afterwards. 500,000 tons of material for each tower, 1 million tons of steel, concrete, asbestos, and other materials. And again, 100,000 workers total between the two towers and hundreds of thousands of visitors. I mean, the scale of this. So yeah, and I knew that. Again, New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey. New York City was my home city. My home city was attacked that day. And I knew those towers. I'd been in those towers, been near those towers. And I knew those towers held tens of thousands of workers. I was figuring myself about 40,000, 50,000 people, about half of the total capacity of the two towers. So, one full tower, total people died that day. We got so lucky. And one of the reasons we got so lucky is because of how the terrorists conducted the attack. They had to take the first flights out because they were trying to, get in there when not a lot of people were around and get on these flights, that first of the morning flights, which weren't as full. So they wouldn't have as many people to deal with, to get into the cockpits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were very, quote unquote, smart, insidiously so in that. But by taking those first flights, they hit those towers pretty early on in the morning before they were full. And so obviously once they were hit, people that would normally go in there, getting there at 9 in the morning, 9:30 in the morning, they're like, I'm out of here. I'm turning around. I'm going back home. I'm getting off the island like you were doing. So we were collectively very lucky in that regard. Now, Chuck, one thing is I want to understand. So you didn't, even though you have this better vantage point at, roughly 10:30, what was it, 10:29 or so when the second, or 10:28 when the second tower fell, you didn't actually see it fall, but you just saw that smoke again, that different kind of smoke, right?
Yeah. And this is where everything's kind of like in a haze for me.
Right.
And I haven't been able to talk to some of the people that I was there with that day because Michael lives in Ireland, and Kit's still in New Jersey, but we're a little bit out of touch right now. Because I do recall sometimes that I kind of see in my head the tower falling, but I'm not sure if I just made it up. Like, I don't know, but I knew for a fact that when it did fall, I knew it fell.
Right.
Because just the way the smoke was oriented, the people that were on the ferry, there was only really one way people were looking on that boat.
Right. Of course.
It was in the area of downtown, because as you start heading over there, you have this amazing view of all of Manhattan from that vantage point. Because you're that far north, when you're in that 50s and you're heading over to Weehawken, you have this amazing view that you can see all of Midtown going down to all the way downtown. And so it's an amazing view. And I've been across that area multiple times, going into different parts of Hoboken and obviously Jersey City. But during that, everyone was kind of in that somber moment, because it's almost like we felt like we escaped the island, literally feeling like we escaped the island. And everyone was like, didn't want to jinx anything by even really talking to each other. It was like,
in that moment.
And so I don't recall, again, it's 20 years ago, and it's just a blur. And sometimes it's hard to process it correctly, because your mind just fills in crazy blanks sometimes when you don't want to adjust to the emotional part of it. But I always go back to my main thought is just trying to reconcile the loss of life at that magnitude so close to you. That was one thing I wasn't really prepared for. You know what I mean? It's like, I'd imagine like in the military that I could worst case, maybe I got in a gun battle or something like that. And around me were dying a little bit, which I kind of like imagined and tried to prepare for a little bit, and you just kind of imagine yourself in scenarios like that, but you never imagine yourself in a scenario where you're just thinking so close to you, all these people's souls kind of like, boom, their lives are gone. And I was literally thinking tens of thousands, like this could be like 50,000 people.
Same. Yeah. Like I said earlier.
And not being an engineer, not thinking, it's like, how are those buildings falling? You know, they falling sideways. Those are huge. How many blocks are, I wasn't imagining them pancaking. I was like imagining like the worst case, like how are they falling?
Right.
Like which direction are they falling, and how much of downtown's going to be destroyed? It's all this going in real time. And I'm trying to like prepare myself for like, is it ever going to be the same? Like, because I had we didn't see anything. It's not like we were watching live video anymore. We were all just like shell shocked. It was really the first time I was really more shell shocked than anything. Is like, how could this happen? No way could these things be gone. It's impossible.
Right.
What do you mean they fell, that they're down? Right. And so it's like I had a chance to breathe, but at the same time, on the boat, because I felt like we accomplished something and we still weren't home. And I felt we escaped maybe potential chaos. But I was just wondering what was going on down there at the time. How crazy was it going on? And like, what's happening next in the world? Like, what other stuff do we just don't know is going on? Like, there are other targets that are being hit, other places. Of course. Yes. Because, at that point, we didn't know about the other plane.
Right. Because you weren't watching the news at that point. You weren't awake. Yeah. In the dark. Yeah. At that point.
Blackout. Other than getting phone calls, we really didn't have a clue. And so anyway, I just knew life had changed in a significant way. There was so much unknown. At some point, as we were crossing the river there, I was thinking, well, I got to start thinking what we're going to do next, because everyone's like listening to my direction at this point.
Right. If I could interject real quick here, Chuck, before you, because I want to kind of touch upon, I don't want to lose kind of some good things you mentioned here, and then we'll continue with the next steps here. One of the things you mentioned, and I never thought about this, because for me, like most Americans that day, we're not in New York City. 1.5 million people living there. That is not majority of American citizens. I was watching it on TV. I was across the country, 2,700 or so miles away. But I can think of, in relation to what you're saying, sadly, car accidents are very common, and oftentimes they're fatal. sometimes they're fatal. So when I've passed a car accident, and sometimes you can know when it's really bad, you see the ambulances, you see people on stretchers, you see blood. And when I passed a car accident and I see, maybe a more serious one or multiple cars, and it looks like someone may have died or really badly injured, it's a somber moment. And it's like, oh my God, someone died. But I have never been in a scenario like you where you're right there, just a few miles away, and you're smelling it, all like we talked about, how somber and how, whether you believe or not in souls and all that kind of thing. That's a whole other conversation we're not going to have today. But just the immensity of the moment, that's a very interesting perspective. And I can't even begin to imagine what it would have been like you were experiencing there. So I understand. Yeah.
Even after 20 years, I get emotional just thinking that loss of life. But I'm saying to give people perspective, again, I think that was a good one with the car accident. When you drive by the car and you see like someone's injured and you find out maybe that someone had died.
Right.
And you react a certain way. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just got close to it. Even if you have a family member and they die near you, that's really emotional, because you're imagining something spiritual, even if you don't believe in a God or anything else like that. There's loss, and that it's just the magnitude of suffering, just the life, and then everyone else around that suffering. Is just how immense it is to know it's so close to you, like you can touch it. And that's why I started with the smell. The smell just becomes like imprinted into your like psyche. Anytime any kind of smoke that there's some burn to it, where there's something electrical or something different than wood, it just triggers that. And the thing later is like that smell was there for weeks because of the simmeringness of it. You could smell it all the way down into the Jersey Shore, that just pungent smell of burning. Everyone it was hard to talk about, but you're just like knowing that they're rescuing people, and it's all part of that. It was permanently in you. You know what I mean? It was part of you. I'm saying that suffering was in you. You couldn't escape it.
Right.
And no matter, even if you weren't there that day, people in New Jersey there, and people that had to commute in there, had to go there, the people that definitely went there and had to smell it firsthand. It's just that it was crazy. And the only thing and it's not to get too far off, but sometimes family members, they get ashes and they throw in the air, and it just kind of floats there, and it just kind of becomes part of everything and everyone.
Right. Scattering ashes. Right.
And there is some catharsis to that.
Right.
This felt like the opposite of that. The worst. That was like you weren't just honoring something. You're like, it just felt so different. And
so it's so wrong. It's so wrong, right?
It felt really, really wrong. It felt so on the opposite of so hurtful.
Right.
It's hard to escape. And it's sorry to kind of go into so much
graphic. That's okay. There's so much here.
That's beyond the fear element and all the other stuff that was going on. You're just consumed by that. And you just felt like, and a good word to use maybe is violated.
Right. Yes.
You weren't part of this, but I'm saying it just the violation of humanity. It's just, and I think that's what, just knowing that all these people were innocent people or heroes.
Yes.
These were people that were fighting. And it gives, after the fact, it gives you, beyond getting into some of the fear and dealing with fear, it gives you this element of empathy in some ways, where you're thinking, why would I want to inflict that on anyone?
Right.
And that's just me personally. Why would I want to react in such a hateful way that will cause something like this to go in the craziest way, to create hate? And because that's what it kind of this hate just magnified 100,000-fold to create this situation of, and so anyway, and that was confronted with that on that boat ride.
Front and center, right in front of you. Yeah.
You could not avoid it, because it was unavoidable. It just would floored you, and you could just see it in people. That
yeah. I mean, and I do want to touch upon that, although that's not necessarily related to the fear aspect. And then I do want to come back to the fear aspect with a question about the boat, related to the boats. But I mean, to your point, there are various things that a human being can do. There's great things, good things the person can do. You know, the heroes of that day, we talked about that earlier. Those are great things that people can do in the triumphing over adversity, a tremendous bravery. There are also very bad things that human beings can do, you know, sexual assault, murder of a person, or even a serial killer killing or mass shooter. And, you know, one of the worst mass shootings, for example, is Las Vegas back in, 2017? I believe 2016, 2017, where over 100 people were shot. But even that, as bad as that is, a group of people, you know, there were 19 hijackers of these multiple airplanes, and the number of support people, if you will, all led by Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other lieutenants, so to speak, within the Al-Qaeda. For people to attempt to kill, and they didn't know how many people they were going to kill. They knew the capacity of these towers. I'm sure they studied, you know, World Trade Center, how tall they are, how many people could be in them, et cetera, and the Pentagon and Flight 93. Apparently, when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, when he was interviewed later, apparently Flight 93, the one that Todd Beamer and all those brave souls on that plane crashing in Pennsylvania, it was intended to go to the Capitol building. You can imagine all the senators and representatives and staff and civilians visiting that building. It could have been killed as well. All these targets trying to kill thousands upon thousands, not soldiers, okay? And forget about the Capitol in the World Trade Center. Civilians, these are not even politicians. These are men, women, and children in daycare and school kids visiting and so forth. You know, when you look at something like that, thousands upon thousands of people, this goes beyond a gray area. This is not, is it justified or not? I'm sorry, as a human being, the acts committed that day, there is no justification for what those 19 hijackers and everyone else in Al-Qaeda that supported that operation. And, you know, I might use superlatives here that some people may be uncomfortable with. I'm sorry. The acts committed that day, more than perhaps any other acts or most other acts committed by human beings in the thousands of years of our history, the acts committed on September 11th are amongst the most evil acts that can be committed by a human being. And Chuck, as much as I was impacted that day because I am from that area of the country, you, regardless of where you're from and whatnot, you were there. I mean, it's one thing to watch it on TV and have a personal connection, but you were there, and the emotion, and again, seeing all those souls dying, because, you know, many of them were killed instantly when the planes hit, but many more were killed, and the firefighters, you know, bravely going into the buildings when these towers collapsed. I mean, the intensity of it, and to witness the result of that evil is unprecedented. And I can understand how it impacts you. But going back to the fear aspects and facing fear, I wanted to ask you something. So these boats, so I know that these are ferries. Some of them you were on a ferry, but they're also civilian boats and private boats and whatnot. Were they just in New York and they went over to New Jersey and they dropped off the people, and the people running those boats, they're getting out of New York too, and they're getting away? Or were they going back and forth?
They were going back and forth.
Wow.
It's the culture there in the Northeast. Not that we don't have amazing, brave cultures all throughout our U.S. states, but these guys were hardcore. You know, some of these guys are just like, we're going to help. I'm going to do my part, right? You could see so many people just rising to the occasion and saying, I'm going to do whatever I can do to help. And
wow.
And I'm saying that the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, these people, they're not going to back down ever, right? Not that they're necessarily better than anyone else, but I'm saying these guys are hardcore. And for it to happen anywhere, for better or for worse, I think is because of a lot of brave people and a lot of people in those buildings reacting the right way, that it wasn't significantly worse.
Right.
And the resolve is just, I'm really proud of the way we reacted that day. The people around that area reacted.
Yeah, absolutely. As am I. Yeah.
It wasn't like people were just like running for their lives, where we were. I was very concerned because I just didn't know
right.
how people would react. And again, we were still a good 3 to 4 miles away. We weren't down there in the thick of it, but just looking after the fact and looking at news coverage and everything else, very few people panic percent wise. I personally, I know there was scenarios where people may have done that and people were justified in being that way, but how orderly things were playing out, at least where I was, and the things that I saw, people were there helping. They were mostly calm and they were trying to figure out ways to help people. They weren't just running for their lives, as you would imagine in some Hollywood movie, breaking and pillaging or whatever else, taking advantage of people. They weren't charging money. They weren't doing it. It's like, let me help you get to safety. And that was kind of the theme of that day for everyone who was outside that zone downtown, is people were helping each other.
Right. No, absolutely. And yeah, there was, like you said, the resiliency of New Yorkers and whatnot, because, New York has been attacked and, there's been, it's a big city and things happen. A lot of things have blackouts and, it's not like it's a suburb with only a few hundred people. It's a lot of people have been impacted over the years. There's a resiliency to the people there. I agree. Again, I'm from there. I relate. But, to your point, there was so many stories and documentaries of both, first responders, firefighters, police, but also just people like, you and me, just civilians that were there running up into those buildings and trying to save people. So many heroes that day. And, on the one hand, you talked about in people in these situations, they could panic and whatnot. I've seen this again and again in human history. When war is one thing, that's a whole other story. But in terms of natural disasters or like a large-scale terrorist attack like this, you see when times are at their worst, oftentimes people are at their best. And I saw that myself 3,000 miles away in San Diego. I was part of thousands of people forming one of the largest U.S. human flags ever to commemorate after September 11th, the level of patriotism, how kind people were to each other in the days and weeks and months that followed. We, as a country, we had never been united like that in recent modern history. Now, again, going back to before you and I were born, back into the World War II days and perhaps, whatnot back then, another story, perhaps the Cold War, perhaps, maybe. But certainly in the past several decades, I have never seen this country united as one, and not sadly since then. And perhaps there's something we can learn from that, but that's maybe a little bit beyond the scope of this. But, I do want to just quickly touch upon your answer to my latest question. So those boats, a lot of civilian boats, even these ferries, quite frankly, these ferry boats, their first transfer of people from those New York ports, piers over to New Jersey, those ferry operators, they had every right to walk off the job right then and there for their own safety. All rules are off on a day like today. New York City, the entire city, effectively speaking, was attacked that day. And no, but they didn't do it. They stayed on the job. But even these civilians, this is just like Dunkirk, again, rising to the occasion in a moment like that in the 1940s. And, again, more heroes. I mean, this story is the story of despair, of tragedy, of people killing thousands upon thousands of people. But again, it's a story of heroes. It's a story of people triumphing over adversity. And there's some positives here. So, but going back to your story of this day. So you're now kind of a little bit of the somber moment with what you've just witnessed, and now knowing the towers have both collapsed, but also this sigh of relief for your personal situation, getting your brother-in-law, his coworker, your friend and coworker, you guys are together and you're like, okay, well, it looks like we're getting out of here. It looks like we're going to be, I've been facing and telling myself we're going to be okay. And yeah, we're going to be okay. It looks like more and more. So what's happening next? What is your next step here?
Well, before we get over there, I know it's going to be a challenge. You can imagine trying to get a taxi or get some kind of ride.
Right.
Because I live down in Middletown, New Jersey, down the Parkway and quite a bit of ways away. And so I was like, well, how are we going to do this? We could be waiting in line for 7 hours or something. Because I can imagine a lot of people on that side may have been like, I'm going home. I'm not working today.
Right.
Who knows? And so it was a pretty crowded area when we got there. And so our plan was to walk away from that kind of station area, the pier area there, and to get away from the mass and see if we could maybe hail a taxi or a livery service, kind of like a limo service, but with a normal sedan. It's not a
right.
They're called livery services there.
Yes.
And we got really lucky. We probably walked a half mile or so, and we were able to flag someone down and more or less kind of say, we'll pay double, but we want to go down towards the New Jersey shore, down in Middletown.
That's where you lived, right?
Yeah. And we all jumped in and squeezed in. Kit, the biggest of us all, I think he sat in front. He let him sit in front, and then the three of us kind of squeezed in the back. A sigh of relief once he got on the highway. It was like no traffic.
Yeah.
There was no traffic on the highway. And we got home probably about 45 minutes.
Wow.
And because it's about 50 miles away from there, kind of 114 off the Parkway.
Okay.
You know where Middletown is there. And,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
Central New Jersey for our audience.
Yeah. And so dropped off my friend, and then the three of us went to my house. We got in the house and my wife was already there. This obviously is pre-Chase. My son.
Right before Chase. Yeah.
I couldn't believe what just had happened. I sat down. I want to be strong, but I felt emotional because I didn't want to set Michelle off, and her brother was safe and his colleague was safe. And I was like, how are we here? It was like unbelievable. Because again, we were back home by 12 o'clock, right? I think we were home by 12.
Wow.
And so around that time frame, and just think of what happened between 8:30 or so, right? And starting the day like a beautiful day in Midtown, New York, at one of the coolest locations, having breakfast with the view of like the ice skating rink there behind us, with that beautiful scenery there.
Yeah.
And just to have the world be completely different in just a few hours. Life as we knew it completely. And at that point, we had no clue what was going to happen.
Right.
And I didn't know until we really got home to understand like how the towers fell, because they were just covering all that and re-showing. They had by then all the footage of the planes hitting and at point of impact. They had everything, the perfect camera views of the towers falling from all the different angles.
Oh yeah.
And I still had kind of the smell of smoke in my nostrils, and I'm just replaying views from the boat in my head and trying to reconcile. But I was kind of, at that point, I was allowing myself to kind of just to try to digest everything at that point. It was unbelievable. I still couldn't believe. I was still having a hard time really internalizing what had just happened and what we just left.
Right.
Because we were like in this really nice neighborhood in New Jersey, and it was like, what's going on? And it's like a movie. It's like living in a movie, like just experience. Right. It just didn't feel like real at all.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, this is like Dean Devlin, Roland Emmerich, who are like masters of disaster cinema. Again, I mentioned a couple of movies earlier. They also did 2012, and there's been others, and it's almost like they could have done this movie. I remember seeing the initial when I woke up that morning in California. It was around 7 a.m. my time, around 10 a.m. in East Coast time. Turning on the TV to watch the news. And the South Tower had already collapsed, and the North Tower was on fire. And I remember very quickly to myself, because I'm someone that very much follows what's going on in the world, wants to know what's going on in the world, because we are one planet, and what happens thousands of miles away can impact us. And we're all, geopolitical, globalization and whatnot, becoming smaller and more connected. And I pretty quickly, without, besides what they might have been saying in the newscast, realized, oh, wow, we've been attacked. Because again, both towers having been impacted. One had fallen and one on fire. And then I wound up going to work that day. I was in a cloud the whole day, driving to work. We were, people were expected to work. Nothing happened in San Diego. Got off of work and then went over to a friend's house and just watching the TV for hours. And, nothing else happened that day besides what we've already talked about. 3 buildings that were attacked. The one plane that was heroically crashed, saving countless lives. in the Pennsylvania field, United 93. But there was never that moment throughout the rest of the day of, oh, wow, thank God nothing else happened. Because what did happen was of such a high magnitude. There was no room for thought of, oh, thankfully nothing else happened. I was so consumed with what did happen, and not just that day, but in the days and weeks to follow. Again, this is just unprecedented. So Chuck, you got back home, but you still worked in New York City, working at 10 Rockefeller Center there. So when did you next go back into New York City?
After the weekend was over, the decision from the company was that we were going to go back.
So about a week later.
Yeah, I forget what day of the week it was. Do you remember what day of the week it was?
Well, so September 11th occurred on a Tuesday.
Yeah, so we didn't work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in the office.
Right.
But then we got back to the office on that Monday.
So
not everyone came back.
A lot of people could not go back to New York City for a long time.
I'll get a job in New Jersey. I'm not,
right.
People thought, is this stage one?
Right. What else is going to happen? We're vulnerable.
Exactly. And it wasn't obvious how you were going to get in the city and how you would get around. So for a while, it was a question of how do you get to the city? At the time, I had to take a ferry. If I recall correctly, I had to take a ferry from New Jersey to get back over there.
So you drove down to like Hoboken or Weehawken and then took a ferry over?
Yeah, into I think I was Hoboken to somewhere near Midtown, kind of near where I think we were before, but maybe in the 30s. I think it was more in the 30s around those periods.
So more downtown, right?
Yeah, I don't really recall exactly when I was able to start taking the train again.
Right.
It wasn't immediate. It was obvious that from that point on that there was a huge security presence in all the subways and all the train stations and up and below. It was obvious. It wasn't hidden. And you try to compartmentalize and you just kind of move on. But people were anxious at that point because, again, we were working and trying to do our jobs while knowing that everything that was going on downtown was also going on.
Yeah, the recovery efforts and Now, that first day, that Monday, which would have been Monday, the September 17th, a week later, that you went back in for the first time. Were you nervous? Did you have any fear going on? Oh my gosh, I'm going back to this target.
My only assessment was that we're aware, kind of like post Pearl Harbor,
right?
Our readiness changed significantly.
Yeah, agreed. And that's how I looked at things too.
Yeah. I'm saying, knowing a little bit about the military and everything else, the way planes were being boarded when they eventually started flying again, the level of oversight, everyone was in like readiness mode times 10. I just felt like the only thing I could do is just move forward and try to put a positive spin and keep the people that I was responsible for to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Because if you remember back then, a lot of people were saying we can't let them win by changing what we do on a daily basis.
Right. I totally agree with that 100%.
A big thing from the president down to everyone, especially New Yorkers and everyone in that region is like, we're going to get them back. Obviously, someone's on that job, but we're not going to let them make us afraid and fearful, not go back to work, do what we're doing because we can't hole up in our houses the whole time. Some people, I think, did that, but most people said, we're going back. We're just going to assume the best and move on. If we survive that day, we can survive any day.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you on that. And that was part of that people rising to the occasion I spoke of earlier. Well, it was just the bravery, all of the thousands of people from all over the country, all over the world, not just firemen, civilians. I had friends in San Diego. They went to New York City to help with the rescue efforts, recovery efforts. And again, some people were recovered in the first few days, at least alive, not many, sadly, and just all, the cleanup efforts, et cetera. But in addition to that, people rising to the occasion of, we are not going to let them win. Like you said, we are going to continue to live our lives and pursue freedom and try to make the world a better place, and democracy and freedom and so forth and all that. To your point, also, you weren't very concerned about going back in New York City a week later because you knew that readiness, and much like the term that was used after Pearl Harbor, was a sleeping giant has been awakened. And that certainly you could apply that as well after September 11th. In the 20 years since, there have been terrorist attacks. In particular, for example, one of the biggest ones was in London in July 7th, 2005, the coordinated train attacks, train station underground attacks and so forth, very tragic. But here in the US, there have been mass shooting events. And I personally, again, we all can give our opinions, whether it be the Pulse attacks in 2016 or Las Vegas. I consider those terrorist attacks. And when people try to attack on a large scale, try to kill people and do kill people or whatnot, that is an act of terrorism, trying to kill innocent people. This is not war. Soldiers, okay, attack other soldiers. That's honored by the Geneva Convention. That's part of war. It's an unfortunate reality. We're kind of a violent species. We're the most violent animal on this planet, species of animal. But in terms of attacking civilians, I'm sorry, no, that is completely wrong. That is the most amoral thing that can be done. And thank God, various things have been done in this country politically and whatnot, even everyday citizens being vigilant, that we've not had another attack here in the U.S. Not to say it will never happen again. There have been attempts. There have been foiled attempts. And we used to, again, our alertness scale that we had, green, yellow, orange, and all that, red. Thank God we haven't had any other major incidents. Planes started flying again, what was it? I think late September, a few weeks later. I lived in San Diego. I was on an airplane about 5 weeks after September 11th. Ironically, came here to Florida to go to the parks, to go down to Key West and have a vacation. And I was not going to give in to the fear. And I'm like, I'm going to live my life. I'm not going to be afraid to fly. And I've never been afraid to fly since. So I'm glad to see that you similarly had an approach of we've got this. We are a strong nation, united, and we are vigilant now, and we are not going to let this happen. So you went back to New York City. The question I want to ask you, Chuck, in the wake of all of this, was September 11th the scariest day of your life? And if not, what was and why?
It's one of the most emotionally disturbing days of my life. I didn't necessarily feel afraid for my life, my personal safety, like somehow I was close to death. Sometimes other scenarios where I was really fearful that I could actually die. And there's a few that I had. Obviously in boot camp, you're dealing with live ammunition, like going through, I think I told you, hand grenade training and looking at pockmarks and, some of the cement barriers and knowing some of the people I was training with and how their lack of discipline in certain things. And definitely, on the firing ranges, when you were going in your lane or your channels, when people are firing live ammo, definitely firing 81 millimeter mortars, like next to your head, because literally that's where they are. And those things have like 50-meter killing radiuses.
Right.
Dealing with those misfires after the fact and other next training when you're dealing with like white phosphorus rounds, and even checking like for car bombs when I was stationed in Germany for a little while during that first Gulf War. It was over quick. Those were like serious moments where I was like, anything could happen. If I had to be prepared for like really crazy stuff that literally could kill me. But I think the scariest one, even beyond that, the scariest day, which a lot of people forget, I think it was October 12th, that same year, where anthrax was going around. It was going to certain news media personalities. And one of the areas one person it went to was Brokaw. And we worked on the third floor, and his office was also on the third floor, right across the street. So you could easily just look into his office like 90% of the time. At any point in time, you could see him in there working or people in there. There's one like, okay, great. That's not just working in New York City. Some of the things that you see is kind of crazy. Like the people you see going to Today Show. That day, as the news was breaking, anthrax was in the mailroom, and you could see, there's pictures of that. You could see even online at the time of people in hazmat suits down there on 48th Street, right there, Rockefeller Plaza, with hazmat units going to, and you could see him in his office. And we knew that they were checking our mailroom, and we all shared the same mailroom.
Oh, wow.
And you'd already heard of stories about people, they were quarantined mailrooms in post office areas because it was really post offices. And there was even people that died, if you remember. And at that point, I was like, you've got to be kidding. We're going to potentially get poisoned by anthrax from our mailroom? Wait, what? This is not something you mess around with.
No.
And not to be light of it at all, but I was thinking that is chemical warfare, here's things you could ever imagine, because it's not something you see. It's not something you smell. It's just something that you inhale or touch. That in being trained in the military, you know they're prepared for doing. You've got special equipment and you've got a special shot that you're always prepared, that you always have with you. That worst case scenario, you got to, take the injection, and it's the antidote for most things. And even then, you're still probably most likely going to die or be sick from the side effects. You just don't know, and you're prepared for all that. And that was where I was like, what is going on here in New York City, and how am I in the center of this at this point? That was crazy. And those other times are crazy too, flying around helicopters and everything else, hanging out. But it completely different emotional situation, more one-on-one, a fear of my own life, not just everything around me. Definitely the emotional impact of 9/11 is just still with me. Just the magnitude of it, just being so close to it, and just dealing with the aftermath for many weeks thereafter, just kind of living the suffering that was going on at the time. The scariest, where I just was afraid for my own life at just being so close to things that could just kill me, or I could die, kind of like jumping out of a plane a little bit without a lot of training. Like, I hope the parachute works. But yeah, those are some of the things that, I've had to.
Yeah, wow, that is incredible. After what you already had dealt with on September 11th, but they're just a floor away in the same mailroom. Yeah, and I remember seeing that on TV. I'm like, oh my God, how dare someone?
And whoever didn't quit at that time, there were some people that were on the fence.
Right.
Quit after that.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
And the people that came back those subsequent days, like, man, we've got a different kind of badge now that we're wearing.
Right. Badge of courage. Yeah. So what I was starting to say is, it's very obvious what's going on there is, here this country is terrorized, literally has been terror attacked and is now terrorized again. And we were a lot of us, most of us, like you were saying, and I've been saying, we rose to the occasion, but still we were on edge. And what's phase 2 going to be? And how dare whoever sent those letters, the anthrax letters, how dare they take advantage of that time period like that? How that just awful. Again, it's an act of terrorism. And anthrax really is actually, it's a biological agent. It's a bacteria. Here we are now 20 years later, in the past year, dealing with a pandemic of a scale that we've not seen for a very long time, thanks to modern medicine, with COVID-19. And, whether or not COVID-19 was released from a lab or purposely, or, that's not what we're discussed today. But regardless of the source of how COVID-19 got out there, the reality is that it spread across the world, and that created so much fear in the media and whatnot. And you and I, Chuck, we've talked about today, the same rules apply, the same advice applies, and certainly advice that I've followed myself. In dealing with the depression and anxiety that I've dealt with in my life, and the panic attacks, I have learned, and through therapy and reading and friends and family helping me through these tough times in my life, I've learned mindfulness techniques and how to deal with anxiety and minimize it, et cetera, where I could use those techniques in the past year. Basically the approach I took is, I'm not going to be afraid of COVID-19. I'm not going to let it destroy my life. I'm going to be sane and be in the moment and make wise decisions, wearing a mask, keeping clear of people and in stores and in parks or wherever I'm at as much as possible, social distancing, but just not going into crowds, not going to spring breaks and not wearing a mask and things like that, just being smart. But I'm not staying at home, and I didn't stay at home. And guess what? I didn't get COVID-19, and I got my vaccines as soon as possible. Well, and it's the same kind of approach and whatnot. And to wrap things up here, Chuck, and again, I thank you so much for taking us through this emotionally very intense and most intense day of your life, and just an incredible story. Something that it's like a movie could be made of it, like we've been talking about. Do you have any final advice that you would have for our audience? God forbid they should find themselves in a truly fear-laden situation like this in the future.
I think some of it's common sense to most people, but still, just to put it out there, it's not like my advice is rock solid. It's not like it's based on perfect science or anything. So all the disclaimers out there as well. And because I always think of my son Chase, who's 15 going on 16, school shootings, these where you have an active shooter event. So usually the way I communicate to Chase and other people that I sometimes talk about is if you hear noise, sounds, significant sounds that sound like gunfire or firecrackers, or you hear smoke, or you're in an immediate danger situation, especially if you think it could be a live shooter event. Again, kind of going back to some of the initial thing is that I mentioned before, you've got to, as immediately as possible, avoid panic and give yourself a chance to not be hit if there's anything going on. And so a lot of people, they just immediately start running if they hear shots fired.
Right.
Anything like that, they just start running. That usually that's not the best approach. You should get down to the lowest possible position, even if you're completely prone. If you can do that, great. If you can get behind anything, you can, because you don't know, even some people that are trained, because of how things sound ricochets, you do not know where it's coming from. So you do not know if you're running into it or away from it. So you got to give yourself a chance to, again, use your brain. So you get down as fast as you can, take a deep breath, kind of tell yourself, you're going to be okay. Think, breathe, stay calm for those seconds. And as quickly as possible, see if you can identify a better place so you don't get trampled or whatever else. Kind of like in the Las Vegas scenario, you've got to see if you can find cover, right? Because you want to increase your chances every second you have, because every second those scenarios mean something. And the more critical thinking you can apply in those moments by thinking, protect myself low, and then can I find cover second, to increase your next decision point. And a lot of people do that during that Las Vegas event as well, or people in classes, they get under tables or go in a closet, whatever, they're listening to their teachers. But you can't overreact. You've got to give yourself a chance. And if you overreact, panic, start running, again, it's just as likely you run in the wrong direction as run in the right direction. If you have someone who you can trust to tell you what to do, great, but even sometimes that's not accurate. So once, again, these are seconds. Again, this is only if you hear noise and it seems like it's immediate, to put yourself in a better situation to provide cover. And then once you're in a situation to provide cover, you really need to make sure that your next step is a good one, right? And that's where breathing, telling yourself you're going to be okay. Because the last thing you want to do, and what I'm always thinking, is you don't want to make the situation worse for other people around you and first responders. Because a lot of times the chaos can make it worse if you're adding to that. Sometimes, unless it's a fire situation or it's blatantly obvious that something's going on and there's no way around it. But if you do have a second to kind of evaluate your situation, again, normally at some point, the shots can stop. But if they're still going and you don't know where to go, more times than not, it's better to kind of stay in a covered position than to do something that will make it worse for you and others. The kind of goal is do no harm to yourself and others. And if you don't really have a clear plan or a clear point of next step, it's almost better to not make a bad decision. And then hopefully over, if you make that 15-second mark or 30-second mark, it becomes more obvious if you should stay or go and maybe what direction you should take. Because if you have the wherewithal to actually go away from the fire or be directed from someone that's obviously in a sense of authority to tell you where to go, great, do that. But more times than not, which I think is a great example of what can happen, that just happened at Knott's Berry Farm. Because you could see from social media video, people that were over by a roller coaster, just for people to know that there was a shooting incident outside of Knott's Berry Farm, kind of a drive-by, who knows who did or what and why. A shot or two were fired. And outside the park, the word got around very quickly inside the park that something was going on. And what you could see from the videos that on social media is you heard people saying things like this: there's an active shooter, run for your lives. Everyone was running where? To the exit. Where was the gunfire? At the exit, at the entrance of the park, where that's around the same place as the exit to the park. And there were so many rumors flying within literally minutes of it happening. No one really knew what to do. And in that circumstance, my only recommendation would be, is that you should take a moment to, if there's not an immediate threat, assess your situation. And before you start running in either direction, you need to make sure you have a good source. You cannot just assume the worst and just hear information from people that are obviously panicked. There was kids panicked. There were adults that were panicked. Everyone without information was potentially sending people in the wrong direction. And again, this idea of do no harm, you don't want to make it worse for someone else. So you got to tell yourself, it's going to be okay. Let me assess my situation. What should I do? And then if you can, find someone that potentially would know, like a worker there, or someone with a walkie-talkie, someone where you would have a better idea what you should do next. Because otherwise you could just find cover and wait. Some people that were smart, some people went into buildings and waited out, or into a bathroom or backstage and waited it out and waited for direction. And they got good information eventually, and they were evacuated out safely. There was maybe a little panic inside, maybe a little shock inside, not knowing what was happening, but they were safe. They didn't run towards potentially a problem. They didn't add to the panic or the shock or, the craziness and chaos of the situation, and they're good. And the last thing I wanted to say too, which is really important for families, you have to have best case meeting places. In the best of scenarios where you get separated, you can meet somewhere. And then you have multiple layers of worst case meeting spots. So for instance, at an amusement park, the best case could be somewhere at the Exeter entrance or some huge place in the front that everyone knows where you can meet. It's like, oh, if I can't meet you there, meet me at the front at this specific spot, this picture spot, or like in Knott's, there's a place up front you can meet there. But in worst case scenarios, like where should I go if I get lost, you're not there, and you're not coming, or something happened? Well, you could maybe meet me at the car if you know where the car is. If they're old enough children. If not, then you guys say you're just going to meet me there. But worst case scenario, if for some reason you can't get to a car, you need to find another good location. Typically, there's places outside the park that you could meet, like at a gas station or a place where you go get gas or something like that. But families need to be prepared, because one thing that happened at Knott's, and sometimes it happens at locations, people get separated. And at the Knott's Berry Farm incident, people were separated for multiple hours, where they could not find their kids. They could not contact them because some people were picking up people in cars and driving them places because there was a lot of overreaction. And so there was a lot of parents that kind of created additional problems because they didn't have a plan where if there was something going to happen, what would you do? And some parents, with the active shooter incidents at schools, they become very accustomed to using texting to communicate. You can't guarantee that's going to happen where you'll be able to contact someone, because usually in these scenarios, everyone's calling all at the same time, all at the same cell tower. So you can't guarantee that. That's kind of one of the more better case scenarios where you can say, oh, I'm here, meet me there, right? But in the chaos, sometimes people they don't think, and they're like, what do I do next? And they may not have access to social media or good information, and they may be directed to the wrong spaces and get kind of disconnected from the normal means of communication. Again, you want to give yourself a chance, and you'll have a better chance if you kind of use some of the best practices of tell yourself you're going to be okay, breathe, try to get yourself in a position where you can feel comfortable with some of your next steps. Again, there's a lot of science to this. You should listen to your parents, listen to people you respect, but if you can, try to avoid panic and have fear kind of create these vicious cycles of anxiety and extra panic and shock, where you just start running around kind of like some people end up doing. You can definitely make it worse for yourself and worse for others around you, and definitely worse for first responders who are actually supposed to help you. That's my big picture take on that. It's far from tried and true, but given my experiences and everything that I think about, that's kind of how I look at it.
Thank you, Chuck. And, kind of having that plan B. The last thing I'd like to say here, and thank you again, Chuck, for this amazing discussion, very emotional, very intense, especially for yourself and even for myself. Again, keeping in mind our younger listeners, or even our older listeners that remember September 11th, but maybe you've never been to New York City, or you've not been there recently. I've been to New York City, countless times since September 11th. Several times now, I've been down to ground zero, where the towers fell, where they were. And initially when they were pits, when they were still cleaning up, and over the years, and the past couple times I've been down there, is after everything was complete, and basically the new One World Trade Center was built, also known as the Freedom Tower, which is what I prefer to call it, given the symbology of it. But most importantly, what I'm getting at here to close our special episode today is two things. One, there are two gigantic reflecting pools, these huge waterfalls with basically concrete railings around them. And on those railings, you will see every single one of the victims that died that day on September 11th is listed. And you can look up online if you actually want to commemorate a victim who's someone who died, someone that you know, a friend, a family member. I've gone there myself because of friends that I have that lost friends, and I've taken pictures and shown them this is they're memorialized, and again, they appreciate it and have some closure from that. And those two pools, the reflecting pools, are the footprint of the North and South Tower. And they're gigantic because those towers were gigantic, not just in height, but in length and width. You know, they were big buildings. But don't make the mistake of just going to those reflecting pools, because there is something much more important right next door. And that is the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Every American citizen needs to go to this museum. The one tagline that came in the days and weeks and months to follow after September 11th, it was on pins, it was on stickers, on bumper stickers, on signs, is never forget. We can never forget what happened on this day. And that is why we've done this special episode 20 years later here with Chuck today. Go to that museum. It will be one of the most intense experiences you'll have in your life. You need to experience it, whether you were alive that day like Chuck and I were, but especially if you're one of our younger members of our audience, if you weren't alive that day, go down to that museum so you can truly appreciate what happened, and so that we can hopefully never have this happen again. And, you know, in terms of the decisions that you make and being vigilant, every American citizen can be vigilant to help prevent these attacks from occurring. Always be situationally aware. If you see something suspicious, a suspicious person, a suspicious package, a luggage that's left somewhere in the airport, in the middle of the airport with no one nearby, suspicious, anything, contact the authorities, police, security, anyone that, you'll anywhere you're at, you'll find police nearby, security, etc. We can all do our part, but go to that museum so you can truly understand the magnitude of that day. And with that said, thank you so much, Chuck, for your time today. And I know this wasn't easy for you, and I appreciate, all the preparation before the interview today. And thank you so much for talking to us.
You're welcome. One last thing I want to say is it's okay to be afraid. It's a human natural response. There are so many people afraid. There's always so many people afraid when they're exposed to these types of events. But you do have power to control certain things in these situations. And that's where you can help yourself and help people around you and come through it out the other side and be okay. Again, being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It's just you're able to take the best of yourself and kind of survive that fear and come out the other side better for it. And, even though it's great to be socially aware and situationally aware of your surroundings and everything else, you don't have to be consumed with threats around you. And because we want people to live their lives and find happiness but you can be observant and prepared. And by being observant and prepared, then that gives you even that much more luxury to, go on and find happiness in life. So that's how I kind of look at it. And I'm inspired by all the other people and families that lost loved ones during that, heroes, and how they're able also to find happiness in even the greatest of tragedies that any family could experience.
Absolutely. That's great final words there. Thank you, Chuck. And again, thank you so much for your time. And you're our first guest to be on more than one episode here of the Coaster Challenge podcast. Hopefully not the last. And I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk to you as well here on the show. Thank you so much, Chuck. You always appreciate your insight and wisdom.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your mission, your podcast mission, and everything you do for all your listeners and people that you meet at all the parks. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chuck. Chuck, I have to tell you, that is one of the most powerful, incredible stories. I was just completely blown away by your story today, where you were in New York. I will tell you that I would say you're a true hero for what you did and how you handled everybody around you that day. Well, I really want to take the time to thank you for sharing with us. And I think this is you said this was your first time ever sharing this story on podcasts or even live radio. So thank you for sharing with that. I want to take this opportunity to give all of you out there tonight my final thoughts about 9/11. So please bear with me because this is something very important. I think everyone should listen. On September 11, 2001, it was a time in American history where we were in peaceful times. The economy was doing good. People were doing very well. It was a good, it was, even before that day, even on that day, it was a perfect day. But unfortunately, that day, within an hour, turned into such tragic that it sent a shockwave not just to the people of New York City and Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania. It sent a shockwave across the country and completely around the world. I will tell everybody who was not around when 9/11 happened. This was something that I've never witnessed in my life. I had never witnessed such unity that our country had and the world. But I will tell you right here at home, the unity with everybody. It didn't matter who you were during that time. Everybody was united. Now, why is that, folks? Why was everybody united? Because I will tell you all right here and right now. On that day, the terrorists didn't give a damn if you were a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian or Independent, if you were a person of faith, if you were an atheist, if you were gay or straight, if you were black or white, if you were English or Spanish. It didn't matter who you are in this country. The terrorists were out to kill us because we all have one thing in common, and that is because we are all Americans. And their mission was they wanted to kill as many Americans as they could and inflict deep fear into all those that they could not kill. They wanted the United States to go in retreat from the world. Because if we went in retreat, then Al-Qaeda mission was they wanted to conquer the whole region of the world and put those democracies in retreat and in fear. They wanted to be able to dictate and tell us what to do. They wanted to take away our freedoms that day. And you know what, folks? We answered back in the most powerful way, not just in the United States, but around the world. Even our own people that we call enemies, other countries like Iran, Syria, North Korea. They even looked at the terrorists that attacked us on that day, and they were like, oh, you guys are crazy little They said, you guys are crazy. We would never do that. That is extreme. I mean, when Saddam Hussein from Iraq even said the same words, that they were crazy. And just like what Japan said during Pearl Harbor, when they attacked the United States, they had awoken a sleeping giant. The only difference was they didn't just wake up a sleeping giant, the United States. They woke up Goliath, which is the world. The entire world came together after that day. It is something that I have never seen in my lifetime, and I'm a little concerned because this past year, let's just say the past 5 years, we have seen something going on in this country that I've never seen in my lifetime, and I'm deeply afraid of it. There is a total deep amount of fear going on in this country, and both sides are to blame for that fear. Our media is also to blame for that fear. The pandemic really exposed how much fear is out there in our country and what's going on around the world. What has happened to us? This is not the United States of America. We are a country that comes together when we're in a crisis, like what happened on 9/11. Everybody was united that day. It did not, like I said, did not matter. But when the pandemic this past year in 2020 happened, that unity that we saw on 9/11 did not happen that day. And I have to tell you, our political leaders, no matter who they are, have a lot to blame for that. And how people are acting, and people of faith, how they acted. It was not what normal. It is not normal at all. This is my opinion, folks. But I am telling you, there is a deep problem going on. And we all need to rise up to the occasion. And we all need to stand up. And we need to say, enough is enough. I am tired of being afraid. After 9/11, I did not go in retreat. I did not live in fear. I went on, and I continued on. I did what President Bush and every mayor and governor said in this country. We need to continue living life and live it to the fullest, because we don't know how long we have on this earth. And we need to stop bickering, animosity against friends, family. We got to stop hating, and we got to start loving each other again. The key thing about the United States is that we are a diverse country. We've always been a diverse country. The whole purpose of building this country is we want to have a country of different opinions. So tomorrow, when you are pausing to remember all those who lost their lives on that day, I have a special challenge for each and every one of you that are listening. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, I want you all to stop what you're doing, and I want you to go outside, and I want you to sit down either on your front porch or in your backyard, or find a place that has a beautiful scenic view, right? If it's a sunset, a beach, a lake, a forest view, or just anywhere that has a beautiful scenery. And I want you to sit down. I want you to sit down for 11 minutes. Okay? For 11 minutes. And I want you to think back about your life. Where it's going. How's it been? What resentments you have. What regrets. What are things that you have not accomplished? And it's time to renew those goals. And it's time to start living life to the fullest. It's time to start being fearless. It's time to end fear. If there's any fear in your life, it's time to face it and end it once and for all. Because this country was built to be tough. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, they were very tough Americans because they were living in times with multiple wars, Great Depression, you name it. They've gone through some challenges that if you were born from the 80s on, there were challenges in those times, but not as extreme like what we saw on 9/11. And it is time to start realizing that we got to be tough and we need to work together. And if we want to keep this country going, we have got to start talking to each other, understanding the problems that we are facing in this country. And we just need to come together and compromise and just come up with solutions. And not just try to have jabs at one another because of different political opinions. I will tell everybody here today, I am an independent American. I swing both ways because both sides have not really shown me why I should support either side. And that's my choice, my right. And I'm not here today to persuade you guys to be like me. I have a lot of friends that are conservative, liberal, independent, libertarian. You name it. I have a variety of friends. And the opinions I hear from everybody is amazing. But lately, I've been seeing a lot of hate, divide, discrimination. It must end. It must end now. We got to stop. If we don't stop, folks, we ain't going to have a country in the next 30 years. We got to stop, because you know why? Our enemies, including the terrorists, and I'll tell you guys, Al-Qaeda is still out there. They've been completely dismantled, but they're still running. ISIS is still going on. And they're sitting there laughing at all of us right now, because they love watching us tear each other apart. And if you guys want them to win, then that's what's happening now. We are letting them win, because we are tearing each other apart. And it's time to stop doing that. We need to bring back the unity that we saw on 9/11, and we need to do it now. Thank you so much for taking the opportunity to listen to our episode today. I know it was very long, folks, and I appreciate anybody out there that really took listened to the whole entire thing at once. I really want to thank you for that. Make sure to leave a comment down below, and make sure to follow us on every social media, and make sure to hit the subscribe button. But I really want to take you the opportunity to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this special episode today. But until then, have a good weekend, and may God bless America.